Our first duty is to the realm. I am not fit to rule nor to be a husband. Perhaps he allowed. But I do not believe Lord Baratheon would let any harm to come his daughter, and more importantly, I do not think you would harm your wife. He paused and considered his next words carefully before he said softly, we have spoken of Daenerys much, and I know you feel guilt for the pain you caused her. You are not the man you once were, and you are not Aes. And even if I were, you are right, no one will support Dany. He agreed. They won't support a queen. And if you do not take the throne, it will be war eventually. If I fall, but Daenerys lives, you need to take the throne to save her. Find her a good match, perhaps with Willas Tyrell. Secure a Tyrell or Stark match for any child you have. Through your child and your match with Lady Shireen you would have 5 of the kingdoms behind you for a generation. Daenerys would be safe. You would be safe. It is your duty, uncle, to Daenerys and to the 7 kingdoms. Viserys heaved out a deep breath, his eyes closed. There was a long silence before he sighed loudly. Very well. Do you wish me to tell Daenerys anything, when I see her? Viserys was silent for a moment, his eyes opened, but he did not look at Jon and instead tilted his face toward the ground. His mouth pursed slightly before his eyes softened around the edges, and he murmured, tell my sister she need not choose. There is no choice to be made. Not anymore. He nodded and man to turn around, but before he could, Viserys' hand whipped out and grasped his wrist tightly. He froze in surprise, for it was the first time Viserys had ever initiated contact with him, and then turned back to his uncle. Thank you, Viserys said quietly, his eyes fixed on the ground and posture hunched. For your trust in me. You are my blood, he replied. I meant what I said. I will never cast you aside. Viserys raised his eyes from the ground to meet his, and Jon was not surprised to see they were slightly wet. Go well, nephew. 299 AC Daenerys Targaryen. The letter had come in the night, bearing the news that Stannis and Renly marched north to King's Landing, away from their ships, and asked that Daenerys and Monterys relocate to Dragonstone urgently. It had not taken much persuading of little Monterys Valerian to convince him and the Maester that, with the recent developments in mind, they should relocate to Dragonstone with Shireen Baratheon and trust the words that were alleged to have been written by Lord Valerian. She understood the Maester's concern for scrolls ordering the relocation of an heir, in the midst of war, did seem strange. But he had acknowledged it was surely written by Lord Montfort's own hand, and he could find no evidence of any hidden messages that Lord Montfort would have included if he had been forced to write such a missive. And so, within the week, she, alongside those who had followed her from Essos and Maester Gerard and Monterys Valerian, had left Driftmark, and by the following day they had docked at the huge port at Dragonstone. She stepped off the ship first, Ser Jorah behind her and Rhaego behind him in Doria's arms, and tried not to keep the disappointed expression off her face as she looked around at her. Behind her, she could hear Monterys Valerian and Gerard talking in hushed voices, the Maester reminding Monterys not to look at Lady Shireen's scars. Dragonstone was a grim place, dark and foreboding. She could not imagine why her brother longed for such a place. The stone walls of the keep jutted out in multiple places, and it took her a moment to realize that the walls were shaped like dragon heads, twisting and entwined over each other. It was incredibly craftsmanship, and she could dimly remember Viserys telling her how the Valyrians had built it with their dragons, using the heat of the dragon's flames and magic to shape the castle. There were gargoyles and grotesques lining the walls and, on the turrets, all shaped like dragons or other mythical beasts. A winding staircase led up to great black gates that seemed to be set in a dragon's mouth. As she looked, the sun caught on one of the dragon's head, and twinkling lights erupted from 2 spots that she thought might be eyes, and she realized there must be some precious gem embedded within. Behind that, she could just see the stone drum that Viserys had told her about. She longed to run up there, to stand at the painted table and look upon the map of Westeros, but she held herself back and instead kept looking at the island. In the distance, looming over the keep and the small village below it, she could see the Dragonmont, and watched for a moment as the outlines of Balerion and Jaerion chased each other up through the clouds toward the Dragonmont. Dark smoke spewed out from the top of the Dragonmont, and Daenerys could not help but think the mountain was welcoming her children home. It is not beautiful, but it is home, a small voice said from nearby. She turned, eyes sweeping around her until she caught sight of the person who had spoken. Her eyes fixed on a little girl, no older than 10, with bright blue eyes, ears that poked out from dark brown hair and a jutting square jaw. Her hand hung down, but as the wind whipped past, Daenerys caught sight of grey and black stony skin on the girl's cheek. Behind her she heard the Dothraki murmur and Doreah hiss, but she paid them no mind, confident that the Dothraki were not going to do anything so bold as to approach the girl directly. "It is not beautiful," she agreed. "But as you say, it is home." She took a step forward toward the girl and Maester, who stood behind her. "Thank you for agreeing to host us, Lady Shireen." Shireen Baratheon smiled at her, her face lighting up and her eyes seeming to bloom into life. "It was my duty, Princess Daenerys. House Baratheon welcomes you to Dragonstone. Please, partake of bread and salt." From behind her, another woman appeared, her arms weighed down with bread and salt and a pitcher of what could only be watered wine. Behind Daenerys, the Dothraki hissed. The smile on Shireen's face vanished for a moment. "It is a sacred rite of hospitality, particularly in the north, I have been told. You are not of the north, but our king is. Once you have partaken, the laws of hospitality and the honor of my house will protect you." She took a step forward immediately, recognizing that Shireen had been trying to prove that she was Daenerys' ally rather than a foe. She took a piece of crusty bread, dipped it into the salt and then chased it down with the watered wine. "My thanks, Lady Shireen," she said quietly. She turned and looked at her Dothraki and those behind her who had disembarked and instructed them to eat the bread, salt and drink the wine. Ago murmured something in return, too quiet for her to decipher, but took a step forward. She watched him carefully as his eyes locked on the scarred cheek of Shireen, and the younger girl did her best not to flinch under the close inspection. ****. They don't like me. She turned her gaze away from the sea, where her children were chasing each other through the crashing waves in the distance, and toward Shireen, who stood next to her. The girl seemed impossible small and fragile, despite being swaddled in a thick cloak. Daenerys knew she was small, but Shireen was even smaller, not even shoulder height with her, and she could not help but think that Shireen may never grow to be tall. She had posited quietly to herself that, mayhaps, it was an effect of the grayscale, although she would never voice that thought out loud. As she spent more time in the company of the younger girl, Daenerys saw more and more glimpses of herself in Shireen. There was a way she held herself, unsure and meek, that spoke of a lack of confidence. A deference in the way she spoke to so many people, even the servants, that told Daenerys of a girl who lacked confidence, that she would be obeyed. And then there was the way would hide herself, wearing thick cloaks, with high necks, and her hair down to hide her face. It made Daenerys impossibly sad that a girl who could grow up with both a mother and a father could feel so ashamed of herself. Daenerys tried not to think about Lady Slyss and the Red Woman, who had barely spoken to her but stared at her as though they longed to strike her down. Yet, Daenerys had also seen a quiet strength to little Shireen in the way she ignored the whispered words of the Dothraki and their pointed looks at her scarred cheek, something which gave Daenerys confidence that, one day, Shireen would stand tall and proud, despite her scars. The girl also seemed unconcerned by her mother's lack of love or care, which under other circumstances, may have made Daenerys feel even sadder, but there was a way she spoke of her father proud in a way that only a young child could manage, that confirmed to Daenerys that even if Lord Baratheon had erred in raising Shireen, that there was love there. For no child was speak so fondly, nor with so much pride, of a father who did not love them in return. As she watched, Shireen's hair whipped back as the wind caught it and exposed her scarred cheek. The girl turned her head slightly, as though on instinct, to hide it, and stared at the ground beneath their feet. In the distance, she caught sight of several villagers watching them carefully. Even as she met one's gaze, the boy flushed and turned his head away. "I cannot think why," she replied tartly. "You are kind, intelligent, funny, brave, pretty. Surely, it is more likely they are jealous of you rather than that they don't like you." "You are very kind, Princess," Shireen murmured, eyes still fixed on the floor. "You think I am being cruel? That I am mocking you? I am not." Shireen's eyes whipped up to her and gazed at her in surprise. "I think you are very pretty," she said gently. "Just because you have the marks of grayscale, it does not mean you are not pretty. People see what they wish to see, and they look for things to remark upon. If you hide your grayscale, they shall fixate on it. If you are too kind to them, they shall see weakness. If you are too intelligent, they shall see a woman who does not know her place." "You speak so openly of it," Shireen whispered quietly, her voice nearly lost in the wind. I could never. Say what you think. She finished softly. Yes. I rather think you should, she replied. Your father is Lord Paramount of the Stormlands by right, is he not? If he has no more heirs, you will rule the Stormlands one day. They will never accept me. Because you are a woman. Shireen shrugged her shoulders and did not reply. In the distance, Daenerys could feel her dragons begin to tire and their attention turn from each another toward her. She glanced back out to sea and watched for a moment as the waves crashed against the cliff edges below them and her two children chased each other back toward where she stood. Would you like to meet them? What if they do not like me? Shireen whispered, taking half a step back as though to flee. She turned away from her children and more fully toward Shireen and put a steadying hand on the girl's shoulder. Sometimes our nightmares come true, and sometimes they do not. But I promise you, my children will never hurt you. Maester Crescent told you of my nightmares, Shireen whispered, her head cast down again and eyes fixed to the ground. Her brown hair obscured her grayscale-covered cheek once more. You must think me foolish. He did, she replied. He wished for me to understand why you have been avoiding me. I quite thought you did not like me. Never. She regarded the younger girl carefully. Will you trust me? Shireen looked up at her with wide eyes. The expression on her face was so heart-wrenching that Daenerys could not help but feel a surge of pity for the girl who everyone avoided and spoke of in hushed whispers. She squashed it down. Shireen did not need pity, she needed someone to show her how to be brave. Behind her, she heard her dragons land snapping and jostling with each other to get close to her. But she did not turn around and instead kept her eyes fixed on Shireen, who had flinched when Balerion and Jaerion landed. I give you my word, she said softly. What if they do not like me? She threw a hand out behind her without turning to her children and smiled to herself when they fell silent at her gesture. They will like you, because I like you, she murmured. Dragons are not like the dogs in the kennels, they are as smart as us. Shireen glanced up from the floor and then nodded, her blue eyes fixed on Daenerys and her chin jutting out determinedly. She smiled and held out her hand, not turning away from the girl. Shireen looked at her hand and flinched minutely and took another half step back. You won't infect me, she said gently, not pulling her hand back. She paused, wondering if she should confide in Shireen what the Dothraki had said about her, and then decided she should not. The younger girl was not ready to hear it. Eventually, Shireen took a half step forward and placed her hand tentatively in Daenerys'. Although she flinched when her hand touched Shireen's freezing one, Daenerys quickly tightened her fingers around the younger girl's. Together they crossed slowly toward where her dragons had landed, still silent and watching them carefully. Once they were but a few feet away, close enough that should either of her dragons stretch their necks out they would be able to press their heads against her chest, she stopped walking. By Sir Ixis Nuha Rakiros, Shireen. Nuha Noga, she said to Balerion and Jaerion. Next to her, Shireen sucked in a sharp breath easily discernible even above the wind whipping past them, and her hand tightened so much around Daenerys that she winced at the force of the younger girl's grip. As Daenerys watched, Balerion tilted his head slightly and glanced between her and Shireen. His head bobbed up and down for a moment as though he were considering Daenerys' words, and then he let out a little squawk. She smiled. Do you want to touch him? There was a moment's silence whilst Shireen considered her question. She watched the girl out of the corner of her eye. So many emotions flitted across her face that it was impossible for Daenerys to register them all, but she did note the way Shireen's breath became slightly uneven. She had half thought that the girl would shake her head, but then Shireen relaxed her grip around her hand and nodded, her eyes still fixed on Balerion. She let go of the girl's hand and, when Shireen wrenched her eyes from the dragons to turn to her, said gently, Go. Reach your hand out to him, but let him come to you. The wind blew another gust past them, exposing Shireen's scarred cheek. Instantly, Balerion reared back and roared, the noise echoing around them before he leapt toward Shireen. She made to take a step forward but paused almost as soon as the thought crossed her mind, as she recognized the noise that Balerion had made as not being one of aggression. She turned toward Shireen, thinking the girl might be terrified, but the girl was still stood there with her hair whipping around her face and her hand outstretched toward Balerion. She watched with interest as Balerion's snout pressed up against Shireen's scarred cheek and he crooned softly under his breath. Shireen's hand unfroze from where it had been pressed against the side of her dragon's neck and, so slowly that at first it barely seemed to move, began to make tentative strokes down the side of Balerian's neck as though he were a horse or dog. She smiled to herself and reached out toward Jarian, who pressed himself against her side, using Balerian's distraction to secure Daenerys' affection. She glanced away from Shireen, giving the girl a moment as privacy when she saw tears begin to bloom in the girl's eyes. Eventually, the sniffling from Shireen stopped, and Daenerys pushed Jarian aside slightly. "Here you stand, between a Targaryen and her dragon," she whispered softly, moving to stand on the other side of Balerion and meet Shireen's gaze over the top of his head. "Tell me, Shireen Baratheon, how you are not worthy of Storm's End." 299 AC Theon Greyjoy. He watched Wyman Martindale carefully. He knew the man had worried for him, for Theon had been silent during their evening meal together and had barely spoken to anyone, least of all Winifred, who he could barely look at. Then Theon had claimed he felt unwell and gone for an early night. Yet, Wyman had not said anything. Instead, he had just regarded Theon carefully and inclined his head when Theon had left the table. It was just past the hour of the wolf when he had slipped into Wyman Martindale's chambers, passing the guards unnoticed, and woken him up. The man had moved faster than Theon had thought capable, and it was only his quick reflexes jumping out of the way inches before the dagger skimmed across where his throat had been that had saved him. Lord Wyman had slashed wildly into the air and then, finally, seemed to realize there was no one there before he turned his gaze on Theon. They had been like this since, Wyman still holding his dagger and staring at Theon, and Theon stood at the side of the man's bed waiting to speak. "Will this require my sword or a pen?" "Counsel," he replied. One of Wyman Martindale's eyebrows rose slightly, and the man lowered his dagger. "That I can provide." He didn't speak for a moment as he struggled to find the words to say, fearing that Lord Wyman may take him for a craven traitor for not coming to him straight away when he had been approached. "That you are here, unarmed, tells me that you still remain an ally of House Martindale," Theon Wyman Martindale said eventually, his voice coaxing just as it always was when he tried to persuade Wyler into doing something she did not wish to do. "Speak. I will not pass judgment unto you." "I was approached today," he began, then he stopped, unsure of what to say next. He flicked his tongue over his suddenly dry lips and desperately wanted to say the words he had been steeling himself all day to say but found himself unable to speak. "By Petyr Baelish, the Master of Coin to Joffrey Baratheon." "You knew?" "Of course," Lord Wyman replied calmly, shifting slightly so that he could sit up in his bed and regard Theon more carefully. "There is not a man, woman, child or barnacle that enters my city without my knowledge. Littlefinger is, of course, the latter." "You did nothing," he said, bristling with indignation and fury. "I did nothing. Why? Why should I act?" "He was trying to turn people against you, against House Stark." "Rather unsuccessfully by all accounts," Lord Martindale replied tartly. His eyes flicked across his room, and he sighed. "Should Littlefinger have successfully turned anyone in my city, I would have known. People are never half as skilled in deception as they think they are, and, sooner rather than later, their heads always end up in the same place on pikes. Was that where my head would have ended up?" Lord Martindale's eyes widened and then he let out a loud harsh bark of laughter. Abruptly, his chamber doors slammed open, and several guards burst in with their swords drawn, all stopping just over the threshold, staring at Theon, clad in his night clothes, and Lord Martindale still in bed. Lord Martindale did not take his eyes off Theon as he waved them away. Once the door was shut again, the man turned his gaze toward the window of his chambers and said, "Do open the curtains, it is a nice night I believe, and I think this conversation is better suited with some light to aid us." Once he had done as bid, flinging the curtains open to expose Lord Martindale's chambers to the bright full moon, he turned back around. He was unsure what to do next. He did not wish to remain standing, for it made him feel like he was a small child about to be scolded, and he did not wish to presume to sit down. "Sit down, Theon." He pulled out the chair at the desk in the far corner of the room, and when the other man beckoned him over, he carried it toward the bed and then put it down. He perched on the chair cautiously, unable to sprawl and relax as he usually would have, and turned his gaze on Lord Martindale. "They used to talk of you, you know," Lord Martindale said softly. "They said you were smart and as treacherous as your father, that you were biding your time until you could slit the throats of every Stark in Winterfell. You were still a child when those rumors started. A better man than me would have dismissed them as nothing but gossip. But you are a Greyjoy, Theon. People fear the Ironborn, and rightly so. It is in your blood, and, no matter what we wish to do, we cannot change our blood. When I met you in Winterfell, I was unsure what to make of you. You were smart, that much was obvious. But there was an arrogance to you that I have often heard the Ironborn are blessed with. Smart and arrogant is usually a dangerous combination. There was also an insecurity in you as well. That is an even more dangerous combination. Insecure men fear little but their own sense of self-importance. So, when our king asked that I bring you to White Harbor and that my son teach you how to crew a ship, how to sail one, how to deal with the politics that comes with being on the seas, I was concerned. I worried that, perhaps, the king and Ned had erred, that they had failed to understand you. I worried about their faith in you, although I had not seen anything yet that should have made me worried. You need not reply, for I know you will claim that I was wrong. I am many things, but when it comes to judging others, I am often quite capable. In this instance, I was mistaken. I was wrong. You were 10 when you arrived at Winterfell. 10 name days is a strange age. By 10, you should know how to hunt and fend for yourself and how to hold a bow and a sword, and yet you are still a child. A boy playing at being a man. Some of your most informative years were with House Stark, and yet your blood is still iron, at least that was what I thought. I asked our king if he trusted you. He said he did. And what is a man loyal to his king to do with that? So, I said I would take you. I was prepared to have my guards watch you night and day. And so, I did. I had them watching you at night when we were encamped on the road, to make sure you did not try to escape. But the thought never even crossed your mind, did it? You went to sleep every night in the middle of the encampment and woke every morning in the same place. When it was your turn to take watch, you did so with pride, which is more than many sons of lords twice your age would have done. I digress. The more time I spent with you, the more I came to know you. To understand what Ned and the king see in you. At first, I saw a boy, forgive me, but you are still a boy to me on the cusp of adulthood, who was not quite sure of your place in your world. Not Ironborn enough to be a Greyjoy, and yet too Greyjoy to be a Stark. I have learned, these last moons, that we can be more than one thing, can we not? You can be both Ironborn arrogant and cruel if you need to be, and Stark honorable and loyal. So no, Theon, your head would not have ended up on a spike. Your head would have stayed firmly attached to your body, because, since the second day after we left Winterfell, I have had no doubts as to your loyalty to House Stark. Lord Marndale concluded. I hope that you will forgive me for using you as blind bait. I was uncertain whether you had the wiles to do what needed to be done, and I needed to draw Littlefinger out. He was silent for a long time, digesting the words that Lord Marndale had spoken. It had been a long time since someone had spoken to him so frankly, for although the conversation with Ned Stark father echoed in his mind every day, he had never felt quite trusted. It was strange to know that someone had distrusted the judgment of Jon and Ned father so much that they had set guards to watch him, although he could not say that he would not have done the same thing if the roles had been reserved. Yet, it was the admittance that Lord Wyman had been wrong that shook Theon the most, to know that in a few days he had proved himself to a man he knew to be distrusting by nature and to be more than of average intellect. I am grateful for your trust, he said eventually. You can also be angered by my lack of it at the start of our journey. It was the prudent thing to do, he found himself saying quietly. He was silent for another moment before he whispered, perhaps even a year ago I would have turned tail and run to my father, if I had been able. As most would, Lord Wyman replied, equally quietly. All sons want is to make their fathers proud. It is our curse as sons and our blessing as fathers. He nodded at the words. So, what do we do now? We continue playing the game. On the morrow, you will find Littlefinger and you will convince him that you are on his side, and once he has spilled the plan to you, you will take him hostage. It will not be that easy. I will, Lord Wyman said tartly. Littlefinger is a smart man, and he is cunning. But he also expects certain things. He believes people will react in certain ways. After all, he has been in my city a moon altogether, despite his movements elsewhere, and he has watched you all that time, and yet he still believes you to be a traitor to House Stark. I do not know how to trick others. And this is why I shall teach you. Go, tell my guards to bring us water and food. You have proven yourself a quick learner, Theon. If we are lucky, I may get some sleep tonight. ****. The The tavern he was to meet Baelish in was one of the seedier in the city, down in its underbelly and in the poorest part. Despite the dust that lingered on the bar and the tables, and the cobwebs in the ceiling, it was still bright and pleasant. He could not help but think that if this was the worst that White Harbor had to offer, that Wyman Mondaly had done well with his city. In the far corner of the tavern Wyla Mondaly, with her usually green hair back to its natural brown and a thick cloak with a heavy hood partly obscuring her face, sat with her back against the wall. Even with the hood pulled low, he could just discern her gaze was settled on him. He shifted nervously. He had argued with Lord Wyman about Wyla being the one to watch the upcoming event. Yet, Lord Wyman had refused to be moved. He was adamant that it was time for his youngest granddaughter to prove herself. There was something to Wyla, sat there huddled under her cloak, that made Theon think that perhaps the youngest Mondaly girl had tricked him, and she was more like her grandfather than he had thought. He pulled himself back to the present as a man slid into the booth opposite him, a mug of ale already in his hand. "You have accepted the king's offer. I wish to hear more of what is being offered to me." The Seastone chair. He kept his face blank, desperately fighting the urge to scoff at the smooth words that were being offered to him. Perhaps even a few moons ago he would have believed them, but not now. He knew that the Ironborn would never accept him on the Seastone chair, not as he was anyway. He would have to prove himself to them, and, even then, his claim would be unlikely to succeed. Most importantly, he didn't want it anyway now. What else? "I am not quite sure what you could wish for." "I want a match," he said quietly, doing his best not to tighten his hand around his mug of ale. "Princess Myrcella." Surprise flickered across his companion's face so quickly that if Theon had not been looking for it, he would have missed it. There was less than a moment's pause, but long enough for Theon to know the other man was hiding something before Baelish replied, "I do not think King Joffrey would wish to be so parted from his sister. He is asking a great service of me. And he has offered you the Seastone chair in return. Which is mine by rights. He offers me nothing that is not already mine." A lengthy pause settled over them. Baelish stared at him and Theon stared back, resisting the urge to break eye contact as he remembered the words that Wyman Mondaly had told him, that a bad liar could never look a man in the eye and that a good liar would never look away from a man. Theon needed to be better than good. He let a smirk slip over his lips as he brought the mug of ale to his lips and took a lengthy drink. He decided he had met the man's gaze long enough that he could be sure the man understood he would not be moved on this, and so let his eyes sweep around the tavern. In the far corner of the room, he could see Wyla regarding him carefully. One of the hidden soldiers nearby was watching him in the reflection of the mirror of the bar. He ripped his eyes away and turned back to Baelish. "I would need to take this proposition to the king. That is most unfortunate, given that I leave on the morrow. What else would you wish for?" "Winterfell. I have no desire for the Seastone chair. I want Winterfell." The same expression as before flitted across Baelish's face and Theon hid a triumphant grin. He raised his mug of ale back to his lips and took another deep swig, although he could taste nothing. "Winterfell it is." There was something in the tone of Baelish's voice that made Theon think that Winterfell would never be his, even if he was to turn traitor against House Stark and House Mondaly. His mind worked quickly, for if Winterfell was never to be his, then it must have been offered to someone else. Where could Baelish have gone in the 2 and a bit moons, when he was not in White Harbor, in the north? Last Hearth was too far, as was Deepwood Motte and Carhold. Moat Cailin was still garrisoned, so not below there. Flint's Finger would have involved risking being seen by the garrison in Moat Cailin. That only left Torrens Square and the Dread Fort. It would not be Benfred nor his father, Theon was sure. The man might have been quick to anger and sense a slight, but he and his father were loyal to House Stark. The Dread Fort then. Lord Bolton. "And all I must do is delay the fleet." "A few days, nothing more," Baelish replied, softly. "Nothing so serious as to draw attention or make the Mondalis think there is a traitor in their midst." He nodded. "That would do it. If it was the Iron Fleet that sailed on Dragonstone, then a few days would be crucial. The Mondaly fleet did not have the numbers to compete with the Ironborn on the sea, but they would if they landed at Dragonstone first. The castle's thick walls to protect the Mondaly men and the possibility of Daenerys Targaryen's dragons, if the rumors were to be believed, would make the castle hard to breach. The delay of the Mondaly men to come to their aid may well make the difference between success and failure, particularly if there were delays with the Red Wine fleet. So, if they had offered the Boltons Winterfell, who had they offered Myrcella Baratheon to? Who would be most likely to accept the offer of a royal match and would trust the word of Petyr Baelish? If they had already thought they had secured the Iron Fleet, then it would need to be a house with landed units. Not Dorne. Theon did not know much of the south, but he knew Dorne would never support the Lannisters. Lady Olenna would not risk her grandchildren in the north. The Riverlands would support Jon because Robb did. The Eyrie then. He felt a smile flicker over his lips. In front of him, Baelish smiled as well, clearly believing he had secured Theon's loyalty. "You came to the wrong den, Lord Baelish," he said, rising to his feet and bracing his hands on the table. "There is not a house more loyal to House Stark than House Marndale. The Wolf's Den is named for a reason, and there is not a son of Ned Stark who would turn traitor on him. White Harbor is not a safe place for weasels. You have no friends here and no allies. We are not the Dread Fort." Baelish's eyes widened and a worried expression slid across his face. His hand moved to his cloak pocket. Theon moved his own hand to the pommel of his sword. Out of the corner of his eye, he saw Wylla rise to her feet, smoothing down her skirts as she did so, and then reach up to drop her hood. Instantly, the Marndale men and women around the tavern rose to their own feet and drew their swords. ***. The next day, he stood on the deck of Merman's Tale. Around him, dozens of soldiers and sailors made ready, rushing about and preparing the sails and calling orders at each other. Beside him, Wendell Marndale stood tall and proud, with his stomach jutting out and his hands resting on it, just as his father so often stood, as though he were perfectly content with his life, and they were not setting sail to war. He glanced at the distant form of Winifred, easily discernible by her hair and cloak, from where she stood on the docks watching the ships as they departed one by one and began their journey south. As he watched, one of her arms raised and then she turned and was lost in the churn of small folk at the dock. "Do you think we will arrive in time? Do you think we will arrive in time?" "Possibly," he replied. "If the information that our esteemed friend provided last night is true." Wendell Marndale gave him a sideways look. "You made my father proud last night." He flushed at the praise. "Lord Wyman said Littlefinger had arrived moons ago, but that he had only been watching me for a moon. Whilst one plot was foiled, it seemed to be prudent to assume there might be another." Wendell Marndale nodded, his moustache bouncing slightly as he did so. "Quite so." There was another brief pause, and then the other man sighed quietly. "I dare say my father will have some fun over these coming moons." "You are not concerned?" "No. My father knows how to handle a man like Roose Bolton, and Lord Willers is no slouch. I am confident they will deal with the matter." They were silent for a few moments, watching as the docks grew more distant. Around them, he could hear the calls from dozens of other ships as men got the sails ready, and the ships began to gain momentum as they pulled out into the bight and the wind hit the sails more fully. He kept his eyes fixed on where the docks had faded into the distance. "She will not think lesser of you if you do not follow through with it." "There is no shame in not having the stomach for it," Wendell Marndale said once they were out into the bight and far enough away from Newcastle that Theon could no longer see the huge structure looming high above. "You have proven yourself already. You need not do this." He snorted. "Stomach for it. I was raised a Stark, but the cloak my father swaddled me in bore a kraken, and my blood is iron. If you are sure." He glanced toward the man who stood behind them, chained to the ship's mast, and then gestured for several of the soldiers nearby to unchain him and bring him towards the edge of the main deck. He turned his head back down toward the ocean below, watching as the waves crashed against the ship's hull and sent spray up into the air. Water droplets hit him on the face, and he closed his eyes. It had been so long since he had truly felt the sea water. It was almost as though he was on Pike, except he was not. Not yet. Possibly not ever. A muffled noise made him turn to the side, and he glanced at their captive again. The man's hands and legs were bound in thick ropes, and there was a slither of rope between the man's mouth, making speech impossible. The man squealed through his gag and tried to flee, although to where, Theon had no idea, but the soldiers nearby clamped their hands down on his shoulders. He moved slightly and pulled the man free of the soldiers. The man's eyes widened, as though he thought that Theon would change his mind and free him, that he could not have misjudged Theon so. "As I said to Lord Wendell, I might have been raised a Stark, "But my blood is iron," he whispered, watching with grim satisfaction as the man froze for a moment. "We are not the Uri, there is no moon door here. Consider yourself lucky. I hear death by drowning is said to be the most peaceful death." Then he pushed the man off the edge of the ship and watched as the rope tied around his legs, that was connected to the mast behind him, went taut and Petr Baeliš's body was swallowed underneath the hull by the crashing waves. Chapter 31, Father. Chapter text. Summary: Viserys and Jaime speak whilst Slyss Baratheon and Daenerys come to understand each other. In our interlude, Aemon and Jon discuss fathers. Notes: so many breadcrumbs that I could open a bakery. 299 AC Viserys Targaryen. He knew that Jon and Oberyn had both gone to speak to Jaime Lannister separately and then together, but the man had refused to speak to them. When the Kingslayer had received word of his father's death, allegedly he had raged for hours and hours in his cell and threatened to burn the keep to the ground, but still he had refused to speak to Oberyn and to Jon. Viserys was not arrogant enough not anymore to believe that the man would talk to him when Jon and Oberyn had both failed, but he did not care if he got a response. He was not there for conversation. He had spent years dreaming of what he would do when he was given the chance to take vengeance against those who had taken his throne. And here he was with an army at his back that was nearly 90,000 strong, with thousands of men ready to die to put him on the throne should Jon fall, and all he could think about was that it still wasn't enough. It wasn't enough to see Jaime Lannister in a cell. It wasn't enough to see Tywin Lannister's head on a spike outside Oberyn Martell's tent. It wasn't enough to have received word that morn that Doran Martell had summoned his banners and instructed them to march north to King's Landing to help lay siege to the city. It wasn't enough to know they were going to win. Mother was still dead, and Daenerys and his lives had been ruined by the rebellion and what had happened after. It wasn't enough. He wanted House Lannister to suffer. He ran his hand down his face, knowing that he was still dripping with sweat, and it was more than likely the blood that had beaded on his forehead not a few minutes before because of a rather forceful spar with Robb Stark was now stuck to it, or, even worse, he had smeared it across his face. He grimaced when he felt a sticky substance under his fingers and, for half a moment, wondered if he should leave and return when he was freshly bathed. Then he pushed the thought away. He was here now, and it had taken him days to muster up the courage to speak to Jaime Lannister. He would not get another chance, for, on the morrow, they would march. "Leave us," he instructed the guard as he stepped off the last step into the dungeon and onto the floor beneath. It was slippy under his boots and he felt wetness seep in, making his feet squelch uncomfortably. He did not react, though he would show no disgust in front of the soldiers nor the prisoners. The man, a Tully soldier, looked at him almost as though he planned to disagree, but he must have seen something in Viserys' eyes, for he suddenly jerked his head in a sharp nod and fled the dungeon without another look. Viserys watched him go for a moment and kept staring in the direction of the steps long after the sound of the soldiers' boots had faded. Eventually, he turned around and cast his gaze around the dungeon. They were large two passageways branched off going east and west with rows upon rows of cells in them. According to Lord Ed Muir, Riverrun had enough cells for 200 men to have a cell each, and, looking into the dimly lit passageways, Viserys could well believe it. He glanced toward the west passageway for a moment, where he could hear distant crying coming from, and then spun on his heel, grasped a torch from a nearby bracket and strode down the east passageway. He walked past cell upon cell of Lannister soldiers, some crying, some silent, some sleeping for what felt like an age, until, eventually, he came to the last cell. He stared at Jaime Lannister for a moment. Dimly he could hear the drip-drip of water splashing against stone, and he realized they must be further under Riverrun than he had first realized, possibly beneath the river. For a moment he felt uncomfortable, as though there was a weight pressing him down, but then the fear vanished as he locked his gaze on the other man. "You killed my father." Jaime Lannister pursed his lips and did not say a word. Instead, he just watched Viserys carefully as though he were an insect, and beneath him it was a look Viserys had seen 100, no, 1,000 times before. A look that made his heart sink and his head ache. A look he had hoped he would never see again. "You are the reason Aegon and Rhaenys are dead." Jaime Lannister's eyes flashed in the torchlight, and Viserys hid a triumphant smile, knowing that he had poked the bear in just the right place to elicit a reaction. "Do not speak of them as though you care," the man said, rising from the small cot in the corner of his cell to fix Viserys with a frigid stare. "I loved them." Jaime Lannister stared at him and then laughed, a dark, dry, chuckle that made the hairs on Viserys' arms stand on end. Love. You do not know what love is. What Cersei and I have for each other is love. What I feel for Joffrey, Tommen and Myrcella is love. You barely knew Rhaenys and Aegon, he spat. You did not love them any more than the Mad King loved Rolla. I remember you, Viserys. I remember you clinging to your father and laughing as he laughed. I remember the day Aerys said Rhaenys smelled Dornish. I remember everything. Do not come to me and say you loved them. You love the idea of them now, but you did not love them back then. You are your father's son. I was a child, he whispered, making his voice sounding soft and weak. Jaime Lannister gave him a pitying look, and Viserys realized instantly that the man was falling for it. He had known he was not going to get what he needed from the Kingslayer by approaching the conversation as Jon and Oberyn had. But he was not them, he did not have the cunning of Oberyn, and he did not have Jon's heart. Even as a child you were cruel, the Kingslayer hissed, his eyes flashing in triumph. And you are still the same now, are you not? I heard what the soldiers whisper when they think I cannot hear, and what the rumors said before you arrived in Westeros. You sold your own sister to a Dothrakikal. You sold her for an army, for a throne, the other man hissed. He tilted up his chin even as he felt the guilt begin to claw at him, and bit down his own smile. This was how he would do it. He had known it. There was a way the Kingslayer spoke when he mentioned sisters and Cersei. This was his weakness, and Viserys was not above using it. I did, he agreed. And I shall spend the rest of my days doing all I can to make amends. You are your father's son. No matter what you do, it will never be enough. That was the man's game then, to try and make Viserys feel guilt. It was a smart move, one that he had not expected from the man who appeared to be all strength and little brains, and he could not help but wonder who had put him up to it. But it did not matter. He drew in a sharp breath and took half a step closer to the bars of the cell. This close he could smell the sweat, blood and shit of the small space that Jaime Lannister had been forced to claim for himself. His lip curled and his nose crinkled as he fought down the urge to be sick. Perhaps I cannot change. Perhaps you are right, and I am doomed to be my father's son, he said softly. But tell me this, Kingslayer, if I am truly my father's son, do you think what your son has done is wise? Joffrey is defending his throne. Defending his throne. He echoed, unable to stop the hysterical laughter bubbling up his throat. He has allied with the Ironborn. He has set them upon Dragonstone, where my sister is. Good. If he has any sense, he'll ransom her and end this war. He threw himself against the bars of the cell, his hands gripping two of the bars so tightly that his nails cut into the palms of his hand. Blood trickled down his hands and onto the metal beneath, but he paid it no mind, and he let the mad grin that he had been holding in tear across his face. He could feel the sticky blood that had still been sliding down his face drip slightly into his mouth. You say you love your sister, Sir Jaime. I love Daenerys. You may not think I love her as much as you love Cersei, but let us consider that I might. That I might love her more. And even if I don't, as you say, I am my father's son. Imagine what my father would do if he were here. Understand that when I tell you this, if even a hair on my sister's head is harmed because of your cunt of a son and your whore of a sister, I'll burn every last fucking Lannister in that fucking city alive with dragon fire, and I'll make you watch whilst I do it. And once your family is nothing but dust, and you are all that remains of House Lannister, and you weep over their loss, I'll shove my sword through your fucking back. You're mad, the Kingslayer whispered. He smiled sharply, knowing from what others had said that the look did nothing to detract from the similarities he shared with his Aes. As you said, I am my father's son. He tightened his grip around the bars of the cell and brought his face closer to it, pressing his face against the cool bars, and met the Kingslayer's eyes. If you want your family to live, then you are going to listen to what I have to say, and, once we are done here, you are going to obey every command I give you, because, and I swear it on fire and blood, I will make what Aes did look like nothing by the time I am through with House Lannister. ****. What did you say to him? I reminded him of who my father was, he replied in an undertone, keeping his voice barely discernible so that the soldiers marching past could not hear them. A few feet away, Jaime Lannister turned to look at him and then flinched and turned away again and continued marching. Behind him, What remained of the Lannister army marched in uniform lines, so at odds with the northern troops who Viserys could not help but think looked like they would not be out of place in the ragtag sellsword companies in Essos or even the Riverlands troops who marched with pride. There was no pride in the few thousand Lannister troops that remained. He knew they did not wish to march with his army, but he had been clear in his choice to the Kingslayer: either he made his men march, or Viserys would see them all hanged, and then he would burn Jaime Lannister's children alive whilst he watched. He wished he could feel guilt or disgust in what he had done, but he could not. He'd do it again, and he meant what he said: they could either fight for Jon or they could die. They did not have the men to spare in keeping the Lannister troops in cells in Riverrun, and they did not have the resources available to feed the men as prisoners. They needed to be part of the army. He could feel Ned Stark watching him, but he deliberately did not look at the other man. He was more than aware that others thought he was taking a risk in his approach, but it was his choice, and he was confident that after the battle by the Red Fork that none of the Lannister soldiers were stupid enough to try and flee and chance their luck against Aerion, particularly when none of them were mounted. It was one thing to try and outpace a dragon when on horseback, but quite another when you were weighed down with your armor and only had your legs. Was that wise? He glanced at Oren. Likely not. Fool. I know what they say of me, he muttered, watching as the soldiers continued to march past. On the other side of the marching army, Lord Edmure, Lord Stark and Lord Robb sat on their own horses talking quietly amongst themselves. Some distance from them, Lord Royce, Lord Garland and Prince Oberyn sat on their own horses, not talking but watching the army in contemplative silence. They say I am mad. That my father's blood runs in my veins and that I cannot be trusted. No one has said that. That you have heard, he remarked. And even if they do not say it, they think it. Bollocks, Oren snapped, his voice rising in anger. Several of the soldiers marching past glanced toward them and then averted their eyes again. No one thinks you are mad, Viserys. No one but you. You did, and sometimes I think you still do, he replied. And the Lannister soldiers watched me burn their comrades alive in the battle. I was confident the Kingslayer would see what he wished to see when he looked upon me, and he did. I thought you mad a year ago, Oren said softly. Not now. Precisely. A year ago. I am not so much changed. Do not believe I would not burn them all in an instant if they betrayed us. A year is a long time, Oren said eventually, his voice quiet. In that time, you have saved your sister's life, saved your nephew's life, bonded to a dragon, returned to Westeros, sought out allies, marched at the head of an army and found victory in battle. When Viserys did not reply, Oren heaved out a sigh and said, do you truly believe I would let you sit here, at the head of an army of over 100,000 men, if I thought you mad? No, he said finally. I don't think you would. But I think you would let me sit here at the head of 100,000 men if you thought my plan was a good one. And you know it is. He was quiet for a moment, wondering if he should say the words before he found them spilling out of him. Sometimes I feel glimpses of rage. All I wanted to do is make someone hurt. Anyone. I know, Oren whispered softly. But you don't. They do not know it yet, but they will soon. You cannot keep this pretense up forever. They settled into another silence, both watching the soldiers as they marched past. In the distance he could see Aerion swooping over the trident and diving in and emerging time after time with fish which he would hit with a blast of fire and then swallow whole. He was larger now. Stronger too. Through their bond still weaker than Viserys would truly like, he could feel his dragon's longing for winter and his hope he would see her, and his brothers, soon. All I ever wanted was to be king, to sit on the Iron Throne as was my birthright, he whispered, his eyes fixed on the army as it marched past. And now, I stand at the head of an army as it marches on King's Landing, with thousands of men sworn to die to put me on the throne should Jon fall, a dragon that within the year I may be able to ride, everything I have ever wanted, and all I can think of is how I don't want to be king. You will have to forgive me for saying this, but I do not plan to die for you nor anyone else. I'm quite fond of living. He barked out a laugh at the statement and turned to look at Oren, who was smiling at him. Their eyes met and Oren let out another short laugh, his eyes brightened, and Viserys found himself smiling back. They settled into a comfortable silence as thousands of soldiers marched past them, as Robb Stark and Lord Edmure and Lord Stark turned off their hill and began to join the marching, as Ghost and Grey Wind raced past and as the last of the army began to leave the great keep nearby. So, what prompted this declaration to the Kingslayer? Oren asked eventually, his eyes fixed on the army as it marched past. You know better now than to let such rumors take root, and they surely will now, at least until you prove them wrong. A screech pierced the air, and from the white clouds above Arion descended hundreds of feet in but a few seconds, only slowing his descent by spreading his wings as he swooped over the top of the army and followed it up the river road towards King's Landing. Another screech ripped out of his dragon, followed by a blast of flame before Arion turned off toward the south and looped widely around the army until he back near Viserys. He spread his wings and let out another screech as he landed heavily a few meters away. Daenerys, he said quietly. For Daenerys I would burn them all. I thought it pertinent that the Kingslayer know that. Oren's eyebrows rose, and then the other man heaved out another long sigh. Let us keep that to ourselves, shall we? 299 AC Daenerys Targaryen. They were gathered in the chamber of the Painted Table, making their plans for the impending attack by the time she finally managed to spend more than a few minutes in the presence of both Slyss Baratheon and the Red Woman. It was a strange group that had gathered, and she knew that her Dothraki, Ser Jorah, the two Maesters, Shireen Baratheon and Monterys Velaryon, who had refused to be excluded despite being far too young for such conversations, the Red Woman, Slyss Baratheon and her, but, despite all of that, it was Slyss Baratheon and the Red Woman who seemed the most uncomfortable. She knew they resented her, for her presence on Dragonstone had changed the dynamic. Lord Baratheon had declared for Jon, and so, in their absence, Daenerys' word was final. There was something about the way Slyss Baratheon looked at her sometimes that made Daenerys feel as though the woman would strike her down if she was given half a chance, and that she was still angry that her husband had bent the knee. She supposed she could understand, in a way. If the positions were reversed and it were her home and she was forced to provide shelter to a girl who outranked her and was the aunt of the man who would be king after her husband had relinquished his own, in many ways, valid claim, she would struggle too. But, she was also beginning to find Slyss Baratheon's snarking quite tedious. I will not be spoken to like this. They are your small folk, she replied, turning her attention back to the argument at the table. You are responsible for them. Imagine the torment they will suffer at the hands of the Ironborn. Surely you cannot be so cruel as to leave them to suffer. It's very sad, but my responsibility is to my family. What if we ask the men to fight? She turned, looking toward Maester Cressen, the wizened Maester at Dragonstone, who spoke to her of the history of the keep and doted on little Shireen Baratheon. He was smart, and he spoke with an intellect that she found lacking in Slyss Baratheon. Do you think they would? If we promised protection for their wives and children. There is a history between House Targaryen and the small folk, Maester Cressen said carefully, his eyes flicking from Daenerys to Slyss Baratheon and back again. And Lord Stannis has been good and just to them. If you arm them and armor them, then they will fight for both House Baratheon and House Targaryen. We cannot let hundreds of small folk into this castle. I refuse to allow it. I would strongly urge you to tread carefully, Lady Baratheon, for my patience is already thin, she snapped. I will not be threatened by you in my home. It's my home as well, a soft voice said from Daenerys' side. There was a brief pause as Slyss Baratheon's eyes moved quickly from Daenerys to Shireen, who had taken half a step forward so that she was stood next to Daenerys at the head of the Painted Table, and then back again. You are a child. It is not your place to give opinions at this meeting. You are only here because I was overruled. But it was my place to greet Princess Daenerys and Lord Monterys when they arrived, wasn't it, mother? Daenerys made to open her mouth to say something but shut it again and watched as Shireen and Slyss Baratheon stared at each other. She knew that their relationship was fraught. It had been obvious since the day she had arrived, and Slyss Baratheon and Shireen had barely said a word at their shared evening meal, but she had never seen it play out in front of her before. Ours is the fury indeed, she could not help but think. It was strange, to watch a little girl who knew her parents loved her but had never seen any evidence of that love, stand toe-to-toe with one of them and argue in favor of Daenerys. She could not help but imagine what Stannis Baratheon, who she had heard so much of over the last few weeks, would say if he could see his daughter now. The thought made her bite down a smile. From what others have said, she thought he might be proud. Leave us, Slyss Baratheon said softly. When no one moved, her voice grew louder, all of you. Go. Shireen cast her mother one last, long and angry, look and then spun on her heel and left the room. Daenerys watched her go, unable to stop the amusement she felt from trickling through, unused to seeing the younger girl act in such a way. Once the door had shut behind Melisandre, who had lingered for a moment clearly hoping to be allowed to stay, she turned to look at Slyss Baratheon again. "I would give anything to have my mother alive," Daenerys said, breaking the heavy silence that had enveloped the room. She knew she should not be so frank nor so rude, but she found the words falling out of her before she could stop them. To not have killed her on the birthing bed. Some days I even wish I had died, and she had lived so that my brother would not have suffered so. But then I watch the way you treat Shireen, and I wonder if my mother would have treated me like that. Do not speak to me of how I treat my daughter. You do not even see her," she pressed on, ignoring the way Slyss Baratheon was glowering at her and her chin was raised haughtily. "You do not even listen to her. Not a week ago, she touched Balerion. She was first person not born of House Targaryen since the dance to touch a dragon and live. It was not your place to show her that she is strong. That she need not listen to the rumors and gossip that people speak of her. To protect her. I have protected her." Slyss Baratheon roared furiously. Daenerys took half a step back on instinct but lifted her head up slightly to meet the woman's furious eyes. It was curious, for she had never seen such rage in the woman's eyes before, and, in an instant, she realized what it was. "Why do you not show her that you care?" "I do not answer to you." "No, I suppose you do not," she replied. "But if you love her, I would know why you do not show it." "I do not answer to you," Slyss Baratheon said, more softly this time. She abruptly broke eye contact with Daenerys and turned to look out toward the sea. There was a brief pause, and then Slyss Baratheon crossed the room to stand by one of the massive archways that exposed the chamber of the painted table to the elements. Daenerys hesitated for half a moment and then followed, shivering as the wind whipped past her into the room. She tightened her cloak around her and gazed out alongside Slyss Baratheon in silence, waiting for the other woman to speak. "Your son," Slyss Baratheon began carefully. "You do not hold him much. He spends much of his time in the company of your Dothraki or your servants." She turned slightly to look at Daenerys, a brittle smile on her face. "You love him. I can see it. He is your son. A mother always loves their child, no matter what they have done, no matter what scars they may bear, and no matter how short their lives," the woman continued quietly. "I love my daughter. I protect her and I care for her in my own way. It may not be the way you believe I should, and it may not be the way that many should, but do not doubt my love for her." "I am sorry," she said softly, unable to look the woman in the eye and feeling cowed and embarrassed. "I should not have presumed." There was no reply for a moment, and instead the two of them looked out at the sea beyond Dragonstone. Daenerys tracked the movement of Balerion as he swooped down below the sea and then burst back out again. There was a flash of fire and she smiled, feeling through their bond as his hunger abated. He was larger now, as was Jaerion. Both of them were closer to the size of horses now, and she could not help but wonder if being on Dragonstone and living in the Dragonmont was aiding their growth. "You should not," the other woman replied eventually. "She touched one of your dragons." "Yes," she replied, turning slightly so she could look at Slyss out of the corner of her eye. She watched as a small smile flickered across the other woman's lips for half a second before it vanished. If Daenerys had not been looking, she would have missed it. It was the first time she had seen such emotion on the woman's face. "How long will it be before you can ride one?" "Not before the Ironborn arrive," she whispered. "They may be able to carry someone smaller than me, but not me. Not for long enough to be of use, anyway." Slyss nodded, as though she had expected the answer. "When they come, they will come for you and for Shireen. The rest of us are disposable, and we will likely be tortured and wish for death long before we are given that mercy. The small folk would be better used slowing the Ironborn down so we might flee rather than trying to use them to fight. These are not soldiers. They are fishermen and farmers. I'll protect her." Slyss whipped her head around to look at her. "That is not what I am asking," she said sharply. When Daenerys flinched back, Slyss pressed on, her voice urgent yet barely above a whisper quickly. "The Lannisters will be desperate to get hold of Shireen. Their army is gone. Tywin Lannister is dead. Jaime Lannister is in chains. If there is any chance they can force my husband into supporting Joffrey, they will do all they can. You know what they did to Aegon and Rhaenys. You will not let the same or worse be done to my daughter." I do not want your protection, I want your word you will not let it happen to her. If you wish to overrule me on this, if you wish to allow small folk to cower in my home, and to arm them and armor them with the last of our supplies, then you will make this promise to me. She wanted to say no, to yell that she could not, but she did not. Her mind turned to Roigo, the thought of what might happen to him should they lose, making her feel so sick that she almost lost the contents of her stomach for a moment. It was a horrible realization to face, to realize there were worse fates than death. You understand, Sliss Baratheon said softly. There was a harsh smile on her lips despite the fact her brows and eyes were softened almost as though she felt sympathy for Daenerys. I understand, she whispered back, once the urge to be sick had abated. Good, the other woman continued softly, turning away from the sea in the distance and heading back toward the painted table. Now we understand each other, shall we begin? ****. The Ironborn arrived a few days later, in the middle of the night. She was roughly shaken awake by Ser Jorah, who was already fully armed and armored as he hastily left the room to allow Doriaire to enter. Doriaire headed straight over to where Roigo slept and scooped her son out and began dressing him quickly before swaddling him in a thick blanket. How far away are they? She asked as she put boots onto her feet and began to wrap a cloak tightly around her shoulders. Tonight was not a night for pretty dresses. Ser Jorah believes they will make land in an hour or less. And the gates? Opened, Khaleesi, Doriaire replied quietly, using the title she and the rest of Daenerys' people had not used in moons. As you and Lady Sliss ordered. When Daenerys straightened up, Doriaire passed Roigo to her and Daenerys pressed a quick kiss to her son's head. She nodded and they left the room together with Roigo clasped tightly in her arms, heading toward Stannis Baratheon's Solar. Although a dark and dingy room, it was large enough to allow her people and those who resided in Dragonstone with her for now to group together. She and Doriaire were the last to arrive, closing the door they entered through with a sharp snap that gained the attention of everyone else in the room. The Dothraki glowered at her, likely still frustrated by her command that they were not to stay with her, whilst the children and Maestas looked at her with terror in their eyes. Princess Daenerys, Sliss greeted quietly. Everything is as we agreed. Then we are ready, she replied. Cool. These are Ironborn, she interrupted quietly, looking at Aggo. They cannot be reasoned with, and they will not stop. If they get hold of any of the women, they inflict such harm on them that they will wish for death, and if they get hold of you, they will make you watch. This is a stone castle. Dothraki were not made to fight in a stone castle or on foot. You were meant to fight on horseback. You wish to fight? Then first find your horses and find open land. That is my command. Khaleesi, Aggo replied, his voice tight. His eyes flicked to Ser Jorah, and she watched a silent exchange passed between them. She pressed a final kiss against her son's head and instinctively tightened the blanket that was swaddled around him, even though she knew he could feel no chill. His blood ran hot. Then she passed her son into Shireen's open arms and said, Go. Princes. No, she said sharply. Follow Rakero and my Dothraki and take Roigo to the Dragonmont. They will focus on the keep. You must secure the high ground whilst you can. We will give you as much time as we can. Once you reach the Dragonmont, one of my dragons will find you there and they will aid you. Cool. My son was declared the stallion that will mount the world, she said, glancing at Rakero who had spoken. You will protect him and Lady Shireen and my people, those are my orders, as your Khaleesi. There was a brief pause and Rakero pursed his lips, tossed his braid and glared at her, and for half a second she thought he might strike her down, but then he nodded. It had been the first time since before they had left Essos that she had declared herself to be their Khaleesi, because she had not felt like one for a long time, long before the birth of Roigo, but if she had to use their superstitions and culture against them to secure her son's safety, then she would. And she would do it gladly. Shireen nodded, her arms tightening around Roigo. We will protect him. She nodded and turned to Lady Sliss, Monterys Valerian, the two Maestas and the Red Woman. Go with them. Lady Sliss pursed her lips, but Daenerys tilted her head toward Shireen who, although she stood tall and proud, was still shaking slightly, and Sliss glanced toward her daughter and then inclined her head. Her hand moved slightly as though to touch Shireen, but she dropped it almost immediately. Will you be safe, princess? She smiled at little Monterys Valerian and crouched down slightly so she was eye level with him. Very safe. Did you not hear me speak to Rakero? I am a Khaleesi, that is queen in the language of the Dothraki. I cannot flee. I must head toward the battle and face our enemies. I should stay. I think Lady Slyss and Lady Shireen will feel much safer with you in their presence. Monteris looked at her, clearly not believing a word she said, but then nodded slowly. Maester Gerard put a hand on the young boy's shoulder, and Daenerys watched as his frail fingers grew white with the strength of his grip. She rose to her feet and, when she met the Maester's eyes, he smiled at her. Maester Cresson, nearby, watched them both carefully. I shall stay with you, Princess Jorah said quietly. I gave my word to Prince Viserys that I would protect you, and if you must send your Dothraki with your son, then my honor compels me to remain with you. She nodded, knowing that she had no choice but to allow him to remain, for Jorah Mormont had proven himself to be stubborn and, above all, loyal these last moons. I would be glad of your company, Sir Jorah. My place is here, Melisandre said quietly, speaking before Daenerys could turn to face her. This will be a war of fire, and there is no flame stronger than the Lord of Lights. She made to open her mouth to disagree, but eventually jerked her head out in a firm nod. She could not force the woman to do as she wished. Very well. Together the three of them watched as the small group of Dothraki, two Maesters, Lady Slyss, Lady Shireen with Rhaego clasped tightly against her chest, Lord Monteris and several of Daenerys' former free slaves from Essos left the chamber through the door that would take them to Aegon's garden and, from there, to the old stables where the Dothraki had kept their horses. Part of her wondered if she should have let them seek shelter in the castle, like the small folk were doing, but her dragons could not protect them in the castle. They could, however, on the slopes of the Dragonmont, and she knew that Jaerion would flee to Rhaego as soon as he needed to, or as soon as she commanded. She had spoken the truth to Slyss. Her dragons were not yet strong enough to carry her on their backs, but she thought Jaerion might be strong enough to take the small girl who held her son in her arms. She hoped he was, at least. You could still flee, Princess Jorah murmured quietly once the door had shut behind the last of the Dothraki. I fled Dragonstone, but a few moons after my birth, when I was but a babe and powerless, Sir Jorah, she replied sharply. I am a woman grown now with 2 dragons. I flee from no one. The Red Woman moved away from where she had been, stood near one of the walls and regarded her carefully for a moment. Then her hand whipped out and grasped Daenerys under the chin, and she stared into her eyes. Her fingers flinched tightly around Daenerys' jaw to stop her pulling away. Dimly, Daenerys was aware that Sir Jorah had moved his hand to draw his sword, but she gestured for him to keep his sword sheathed for now. Eventually, the Red Woman loosened her grip on Daenerys' chin, took a step back, and said, "You were born here." She nodded. The other woman did not reply, but her eyes tightened slightly around the edges, as though Daenerys was something vexing and irksome and she did not quite understand it. "We should move," Jorah said a few moments later. Daenerys nodded absently and followed the man out of the room through the door opposite the one her people had left through. Once they were in the corridor, Sir Jorah drew his sword and began walking quickly as he led the way to the battlements. She and the Red Woman followed behind him. "I heard rumors in Essos that the Red Priests could bring back the dead. Is it true? There are some of us who are blessed with great power. But not you. But not me. My gifts lie elsewhere. The flames give me visions." She was unable to stop herself from snorting slightly. "Shireen said you thought her father to be the prince who was promised and the rightful king. Visions must often be interpreted. I saw a stag bathed in flames. I was sure it was House Baratheon. The stag bathed in flames and the one whose name must never be spoken will come together in the greatest war that the known world shall ever see. What else have you seen?" she asked as they crossed down the quiet passageways. In the distance, she could hear men roaring commands, the few who remained on both the Dthitmark, now on Dragonstone, and the men of Dragonstone who had sworn to fight against the Ironborn. Suddenly, Sir Jorah darted to the side and she and Melisandre did likewise, pressing themselves flush against the wall as several female small folk flew past her, heading toward the cellars. The women paid her no mind, but the child clasped against one of the women's chest raised its hands out toward Daenerys as they passed. "I see him gathering his forces in a land of ice and snow. I see a broken boy heading north to meet him. I see red priests across Essos preparing for the fight. I see kings long dead and children, your children not yet born. I see everything that was and ever will be," Melisandre said, once they had begun walking again. She did not speak for a moment and pursed her lips, unable to stop the slight swoop in her belly at the thought of one day, having more children. The men who remain here are scared of you. Terror is a beautiful thing, Melisandre said softly. They fear me, and so they do not approach me. You of all women, Daenerys Targaryen, knows what happens to beautiful women. She flinched. They crossed down the last of the stairs and headed through the main hall toward the oak doors that had been thrown open. In the distance, she could hear the roaring of men more clearly now, and she watched as Ser Jorah drew himself straighter as though preparing for the fight. On the battlements, around the courtyard, torches burned brightly in their brackets. They stopped on the top of the steps, and she glanced around her, watching as men carried bows and arrows past them and the last of the small folk fled into the great keep. You speak of Drogo. It will not happen again. The next man you lay with will worship you as his queen. You cannot promise that, she replied. You said your dreams and visions were open to interpretation. Are often open to interpretation, Melisandre corrected quietly. This one required no such feats. It was as clear to me as you are now. And tonight? What have you seen of tonight? Fire cannot harm a dragon. She turned slightly to look at Melisandre, who was staring serenely at the scene in front of them as though she had not just echoed words back to Daenerys that said to someone else what felt like 1,000 years before. Realizing the Red Woman would say no more, she began to march down the steps and headed towards the main gates that had begun to creak closed as men pulled at them. Ser Jorah swore quietly under his breath and hurried to catch up with her. She nodded at soldiers as she walked past them. As her and Melisandre began to climb up the stairs to the battlements that overlooked the winding path up to Dragonstone and the docks below it, Ser Jorah behind them, she caught sight of the rising sun in the distance. It was still so low in the sky that it was nearly impossible to see anything clearly, and so it was only when she was stood at the top of the stairs and at the edge of the battlements, and squinting into the distance, that she realized that the Ironborn ships were already beginning to dock. She jumped slightly as the great gates finally slammed closed below them. Lady Shireen. She turned to look at one of the soldiers. Safe. Her and Lady Slyss have taken refuge with my Dothraki. They will protect them. You ought to be there as well, Princess, another soldier said quietly. Forgive me for speaking out of turn, but a battle is no place for a princess, nor a priestess. She was spared answering as twin roars split the air and her children swooped low over the battlements, their tails brushing over the tops of the soldiers' heads. If it were not for my children, I would agree, she replied mildly. But I do not think they will answer to your commands as they will to mine. The first soldier cast her an appraising look and she realized who it was, the commander of the household guard at Driftmark, and met his gaze. He jerked his head and slammed his helm onto his head seconds later. The Red Priestess and Princess Daenerys stay. I shall not say no to more allies. She did not reply and instead took up position near the front of the battlements and watched as more and more Ironborn ships docked and men, seemingly as small as mice given the great distance, began to pour out of them. She could hear their roars and bellows of anger and almost feel their rage, it was so palpable. Tugging on her bond with her children, she called them back to her and, once they were close, sent them to wait in the great courtyard behind. Forgive me, Princess, the second soldier said, his voice quiet as though he worried she might strike him down. What is it that you and the Red Priestess are planning? She made to open her mouth to reply, but Melisandre spoke first. The night is dark and full of terrors, but tonight you need not fear. The flames of the Lord of Light and the Mother of Dragons shall guide us and protect us. Interlude, 298 AC. Aemon Targaryen. I am still so angry at Father Jon admitted quietly. I sometimes wonder if I can ever forgive him, and if I even love him anymore. He considered Jon carefully for a moment, watching the way his nephew's gaze remained locked on the floor whilst his posture was hunched. He hid a sigh and leaned forward in his chair, wrapping his blanket which he had pulled off his bed tightly around him to fend off the slight chill in the air, and said, I think you are too harsh on yourself. Despite what you claim, you love your father, but you may not like him. There is a difference. They were seated in Aemon's rooms again. It was early. So early that the sun had barely crested on the horizon, and, given the location of Aemon's chambers, his room was still in virtual darkness. Only the flickering flames of the fireplace gave off any light. He had been awake for hours now though, waiting for Jon. He felt like he was always waiting these days. Waiting for Jon to ask more questions, to seek more knowledge, or just to spend time with him. He glanced toward the door, wondering when Ghost, who Jon claimed had gone off to hunt, might return, for he missed the direwolf's presence and, more importantly, his thick fur coat that he could stick his freezing fingers into to warm up. "Did you like your father?" "Fathers are difficult," he said eventually, turning to look at the door again rather than looking at Jon, despite the fact he could feel the weight of his nephew's gaze on him. "I said to you before that Maker was not a bad father. He loved my mother. He loved me and my siblings. He even loved Arion despite the pain and strife that Arion caused him. He loved me, even though I believe that I disappointed him. Yet, despite the failings of so many of his children, he loved us still. Did I love him? Undeniably, he was my father. I love him still, even though he has been dead for over 65 years. Did I like him? I suppose that is the more accurate question. I did not like him as a child. I thought him quite cruel and mean-spirited. I did not truly like him when I was a man grown. I found him demanding and his judgment to be damning. I found the way he handled the death of my mother to be repugnant. The benefit of age, I suppose, is that I look back on all he did for me and my brothers and sisters and, I realize, I quite liked him. I imagine, if I had not been his son and had instead been his equal in so much that a king can have an equal, we might have been friends. He was smart. He was cunning. He could, on occasion, be funny. He tried to be kind, although it did not come naturally to him. He loved his family. Those are all qualities I admire in a person. I know why Father did it, Jon replied a few moments later. I understand why he did it. I just cannot forgive him. No matter how hard I try and how much I want to, I cannot forgive him. But that does not mean you do not love him, he remarked. We can be angry at those we love, we can hate them, we can despise them, but that does not mean we love them any less. I am sure there are some who hate their family. There are, and often with good reason. But hating someone who has only ever tried to protect you seems like a foolish waste of energy, if I might be blunt. Are you not always? He smiled wryly at Jon. I can be subtle, when I must be, he replied. But look at Lord Tyrion. It is clear his family holds no love for him, yet he loves them still. It must be a horrible thing, to have a family who do not love you. Something you need never fear, he said gently, watching carefully as Jon flushed brightly and refused to meet his gaze. Everything that Lord Stark and Benjen have done has been to protect you. They did it because they loved you. And you know that, and that is why, despite what you say, that you still love them as well. He turned toward the fireplace, his eyes fixing on the gold and grey dragon egg that was nestled in the flames. The small dragon on top of it, as though sensing his gaze, opened her eyes, let out a soft croon, and then closed them again and heaved out a deep breath as though perfectly content. I feel so angry at him, and then I feel so guilty, not because I do not have a right to be angry, but because I can feel her discontent that I am angry. You believe she understands? Yes, Jon murmured. I think she knows why I am angry and, more importantly, I believe she is angry at me for feeling the way I do. Dragons are strange creatures, he replied softly, glancing at the dragon and then back to Jon. She likely understands you feel frustration toward your father, but she cannot understand why, because although she is intelligent, she is not human. Her emotions are complex, yes, but they are not as complex as ours. There was a scratch at the door then, and he sighed, rising to his feet as he did so. He wrapped the blanket more snugly around him and carefully crossed over to the door, opening it widely enough to allow Ghost to enter before shutting it again as a gust of frigid air burst into the room. He glanced toward Ghost, who was making his way over to Eamon's chair and, once there, threw himself onto the floor with a gentle puff of air and stared at Eamon expectantly. Eamon smiled, unable to help himself, and headed back to his chair. Once settled down in it, Ghost moved slightly and rested across Eamon's feet with his back pressed up against Eamon's lower legs as though he knew Eamon wished for something to warm his chilled bones. I hope I see Father again, Jon whispered. So, I can tell him that I forgive him. He already knows, he said softly, letting his eyes drift closed as he began to tire slightly. You're his son. He knows. Chapter 32, Betrayal. Chapter text. Summary: Eamon has two very important conversations. One of them is just rather one-sided. Daenerys realizes that loyalty is a fragile thing. Notes: Euron Greyjoy features in this chapter, consider that as much of a warning as you wish it to be. No interlude this time, given we have an Eamon Povey. Enjoy. Translation: Lord of Light, give your light to us. Lord of Light, defend us. Lord of Light, the dragon is fire made flesh. Lord of Light, use his fire as yours. For the night is dark and full of terrors. 299 AC Aemon Targaryen. It was not yet dawn when he left his chambers and went to the Ravenry. In truth, he did not think there would be any ravens waiting for him, but he longed to get away from his chambers. The pushing and tugging at the edge of his mind was beginning to cause confusion, for he was unsure, on occasion, which thoughts and emotions were his and which belonged to the dragon egg. The egg. The egg that had been silent for nearly 80 years. That, just a year before, he had held at his nephew's urging and felt nothing from. The egg that, now, plagued his every waking hour and, on occasion, even his dreams. He walked slowly, taking more care than he usually did, for because the sun had not yet fully risen the wooden pathway was icy and slippery. He glanced toward where the sun was beginning to rise in the distance, the top of it only just discernible on the horizon, and prayed it would be a warmer day than the last few had been. A breeze whipped past him, as though to dissuade him of any hope, and he smiled. One could always count on nature to do as it willed. It took but a few minutes to leave his chambers and enter the Ravenry. The windows opened out to the south, allowing the ravens to come and go with ease, and even though there was a door and wall on one side to try and prevent a through breeze, it was still bitterly cold. He shivered slightly again and gazed around the Ravenry. He counted the ravens slowly, not wanting to make any mistakes, and thus prolong his time in the cold, and then when he thought he had miscounted, counted twice more. He squinted slightly at 2 ravens that were huddled together, near where he might reasonably be expected to take any missives, and then hobbled over once he realized, he was not wrong, there were scrolls attached to the ravens, and thus he had been right with his initial count. It took longer than he had hoped to extract the scrolls from their legs, for his fingers were covered in thick gloves and were clumsy and unable to find traction against the mechanism keeping the scroll in place. Eventually, he had to tug the gloves off in order to loosen the scrolls. Once he was done, he shoved both scrolls in his cloak pocket and hastily pulled his gloves back on and exited the Ravenry as quickly as he could. It was only once he was back in his chambers, and he had tossed the scrolls on the desk, that he pulled his gloves off and looked at his fingers. He hid a wince. They were almost blue. Moving quickly, he crossed over to the hearth and shoved his hands over the flames, willing them to heat up as fast as was safe. As he looked down at his freezing fingers, his eyes alit on the dragon egg nestled in the wood just below, and he sighed. There was another faint brushing against his consciousness, and he pushed it away as he turned away from the flames. A flash of hurt echoed across his mind for a moment, giving him pause. He turned, glancing back toward the flames and the egg within for a moment, and felt a pang of longing shoot through him. He sighed and reached his hand out into the flames and brushed his fingers along the edge of the egg, not quite in the flames but still warm to the touch. There was another brief tug on his mind, as though the dragon within the egg was accepting his apology, and then the feeling withdrew. He pulled his hand away and turned back around. It was always worse when he gazed upon the egg. Worse still when he held it. But sometimes he could feel the dragon brush against his mind the way a small child might grasp its mother's hand to seek affection, and that was always when he caved, unable and unwilling to leave the creature alone. His fingers were still cold, but the numbness in them had abated, so he unfolded one scroll and then another, reading them quickly. As soon as he had read the second, he dropped them both on his desk and crossed toward the door of his chambers. He cast one longing look at the fireplace and then opened the door and darted through as fast as he was able, slamming the door shut behind him. Within a few moments he was back in his chambers, having awoken Chet and sent him to find Benjen Stark urgently. Whilst he waited, he grasped the first scroll again, reading and then rereading the words 100 times. He could feel tears slipping down his face long before they began to drop onto the words below, but he paid them no mind. His eyes remained fixed on the words he could no longer read, for by now the paper was so crumpled and the ink so wet and smudged that he could not read a single word of what had originally been written, but he could remember. By the gods, he could remember every word. He would never forget it. Uncle Aemon. Viserys rides for King's Landing at the head of my army. Ironborn sail for Dragonstone and Daenerys. I will meet them there. Your nephew, Jon. He would have been more worried by such a short missive if it had not been for the second one, that had managed to arrive at the same time, from Willers Tyrrell. He glanced at the scroll on his desk for a moment, his eyes flicking down the words quickly, taking in as much information as he could from so few letters. Benjen Stark. I write to you from Winterfell, where my sister and I have remained following her marriage to Robb Stark. The war in the south is all but done, but we hear rumors of a situation in the north that may require our attention. We would welcome the guidance of a man of the Night's Watch. Lord Willers Tyrrell. He had given much advice to Jon about the houses in the south, and he was glad to see that his instincts on House Tyrell and on Olenna Tyrell in particularly had been correct. Clearly, she had a hand in raising her grandson. In only 9 words he had managed to confirm that no one from House Stark, or House Tyrell, had died in the battles that had taken place so far, that Margaery Tyrell was not with child, and that Aemon had been right not to worry from Jon. The second part of his missive though, that worried him. He could only think of one situation in the north that might have concerned those still at Winterfell, and it did not bode well if they were already hearing about it. He doubted many wildlings had fled south, yet for Benjen had been clear that they were massing an army north of the wall. Why would anyone risk fleeing now if an army was to converge on the wall? Even if one did not wish to be part of the army, they would be smart to wait until the Night's Watch and the North were distracted by the army before they tried to make the treacherous journey across the wall. And, despite what others might say, there was nothing so smart as a man who feared for his life. No. He doubted whether any wildlings had made it to Winterfell yet and told their tales. It was something else then. That did not make him feel any better. For, if those in Winterfell knew something was wrong, how did they know? He would keep that to himself though, no need to worry Benjen over such details. He heaved out a gentle sigh and turned to look at the fireplace and let his eyes fall on the egg again. The gold and grey egg sat in between hot coals and bits of firewood and seemed to gleam in the firelight. Daeron's egg was as beautiful as it ever had been. He stared at it for a moment, desperately trying to ignore the tugging on his mind that seemed to grow stronger the longer he looked at it. Not for the first time, he wondered what his brother had seen. Ramblings of dragons and their rebirth, that had once seemed so foolish, were now clearly true. He wished he could remember more. But, every time he thought he had grasped something, the thought seemed to slip away. You sent word you had a scroll for me. He turned, wiping his eyes with the back of one hand as he did so. Although he knew that Benjen would spot the movement, he could not help but try and hide his emotion. So many years of having to pretend to be stoic left a lasting impression and an impulse that was hard to control at times. Is it bad news? He shook his head. Benjen crossed the room quickly and prized the scroll out of Aemon's tight grasp. His brows raised and then he smiled. I cannot make it out, someone appears to have made the ink run. But if it is not bad news, then it must be good news. He didn't speak and instead pondered his friend carefully for a moment. Eventually, seeing no need to lie, he said, given all that Viserys and Daenerys had endured, I had feared for them. Benjen fixed him with a perplexed look and then sighed. You feared they would be more Aerys children than Rollis. But they are not, he said, his voice cracking as he spoke. Jon writes that Viserys rides at the head of his army. He would not entrust Viserys so if he worried for him. And Daenerys? On Dragonstone. Benjen froze. His eyes flicked from the scroll and then back to Aemon. I had thought the Ironborn sailed for Dragonstone. They do, he agreed. Jon heads for Daenerys. Yet you are not concerned. If Viserys heads for King's Landing, then that would imply that every other threat to House Targaryen has been handled, he replied. He glanced toward his desk and inclined his head. There is a scroll for you from Winterfell. I imagine that will confirm my thoughts. Benjen looked at the desk and then back to Aemon. If Jon heads for Daenerys, and the Ironborn are likewise heading that way, why are you not more worried? The Ironborn are dangerous, Aemon. You know this. Because Jon is not concerned, he replied simply. I spent moons teaching Jon all I could on politics, of the history of House Targaryen, of the history of the great and noble houses. And he learnt arms at Winterfell and arrived here a better swordsman than the Night's Watch has seen for several generations. I worry for him, that is natural, but I am not concerned. He could fall, Aemon. He could. He will not. You are overly confident. I am confident in John. He would not fly to Dragonstone if he was not confident in his own assessment of the risks and how great the danger would be. Benjen heaved out a huge sigh and rubbed his hand down his face, as though the conversation with Eamon had exhausted him. Then he heaved out another sigh and regarded Eamon carefully. I suppose I shall worry enough for the both of us then. I suppose you shall, he agreed. You should read that scroll first though before you worry about what John is doing. Your worries might be better focused elsewhere. There was a brief pause whilst Benjen's eyes narrowed slightly, as though he was contemplating Eamon and realized something was wrong, and then he spun on the spot and crossed the room. He uncurled the scroll quickly and Eamon watched as his friend's eyes flicked across the words as quickly as any man might hope to. They cannot know, Benjen said finally. They cannot know of what is in the north. Why not? The wildlings have been fleeing south in greater numbers than before and, if what you say is true, it will not be long if indeed it has not happened already before one gets far enough south and your nieces and nephews are made aware, he said, not feeling an inch of guilt for lying to his friend. It was, after all, one thing to think that something else was at play himself, and quite another to alarm his friend unnecessarily. Benjen looked at him with a disbelieving expression but, eventually, sighed. And if they know of what I have seen? Then that can only be good. They will be able to advise. And if it is not what we fear? Willers Tyrell would not have written if it was not something important, he said gently. That it is he that wrote, and not your nieces or nephews, although I accept that Rukan is, perhaps, a bit young to know his letters, let alone write, tells you that it is a matter you should take seriously. Imagine if you had received such a note from Arya or Bran or even Sansa, would you have thought it a serious matter, or would you simply have thought that your family missed you? No. You must go. I do not like the idea of leaving you, nor my post, so unprotected. There is a 1,000-foot wall between us and the wildlings, and it has held for a millennia. I do not think with you away it shall fall into such disrepair that all hope is lost, he remarked dryly. I understand that you do not wish to put your family above your duty. If there is anyone in Castle Black, or indeed Westeros, who understands, it is me. But if there is a chance that Winterfell seeks guidance because of the wildlings or the dead, then you must go. You are not deserting your post, Benjen Stark, you are serving the Watch as you always have. You always know what to say, Benjen murmured softly, his eyes fixed on Eamon and his mouth turned upwards. He inclined his head and then put the scroll back on the table and began to cross toward the door. But you are not fooling me, Eamon, you are sending me away because you want me to be with my family. He glanced toward the egg in the fireplace and then back toward Benjen, who was hovering by the door looking riddled with guilt and twice his age. You may be a man of the Night's Watch, Benjen. But you are a Stark and Winterfell has as good as called for aid. Besides, we can survive a moon given that with no patrols beyond the wall, you aren't doing much good here anyway. Benjen turned away from the door, his lips and brow furrowed, but did not speak for a moment. Is it still the same? You look tired. I am tired, he replied. But I would not change it. It is more than I could have hoped for. A trickle of warmth rushed through him for a moment and then vanished again. If you are able to work out where to send word to our nephew, you may wish to make him aware. Do you need him to return? Him or another? You are hiding something from me. I am, he agreed. It is a matter for my house. John is my nephew as well, Benjen replied sharply, his eyes flashing and his mouth pressed in a thin line. But Viserys and Daenerys are not, he remarked. And I do believe this is a matter for them. Does John know that you have kept things from him? I am sure he does. And he will understand why I have, even if he does not like it. Very well. But if he does not understand, you shall only have yourself to blame. Travel safe. Benjen's face softened slightly as a deep flush crossed it, as though embarrassed by his sharp words that had been met with genuine concern in return. I always do. Starks are hard to kill. He smiled. Send word once you are aware of why you have been summoned. I shall explain your absence to the Lord Commander. What shall you say? That new recruits had presented themselves at Winterfell. And when I return with none. Not every man is suitable to be a man of the Watch. You lie as easily as you breathe, Eamon. I lie for my family. I always have done, and I always shall. Benjen smiled more widely at him this time and then left without another word. The door snapped close quickly behind him, stopping the worst of the chill from entering Eamon's chambers. "I do wish you had waited," he said softly, turning back toward the fireplace and hobbling over. It was harder this time than it had been with winter's egg, to kneel on the stone floor. His knees protested at the effort and twinged in pain, but he paid it no mind. Instead, he reached tentatively into the flames and pulled out the gold and grey egg, nearly dropping it, for it was far heavier than he remembered it being but a few weeks before, and placed it on the floor in front of him. There was a faint pushing at the edge of his consciousness, longing and frustration brushed against him for a moment. He sighed. 80 years I've had you, and not a peep you have made. And now you torment my every waking hour like a small child scrambling for attention. I can only think of one thing that has truly changed, particularly in the last few moons, to make you act so. If I am right, you will change everything." He stopped speaking for a moment and cocked his head to the side as the pushing against the edge of his consciousness turned fond, almost as though the egg understood what he was saying. "I suppose that, given the circumstances, you do not wish to be left behind. It is understandable, even more so if my theory proves true. Even if it does not, I still cannot say I blame you. Yet, I find you are beginning to change my own behavior, and that will not do. All things considered, I think you shall have to wait a bit longer. I am too old to be caring for a dragon." 299 AC Daenerys Targaryen. Steady. Steady. Loose. A rumble of thunder in the distance made Daenerys jump slightly, and she glanced around her, taking in the pale faces of everyone on the battlements and letting her eyes linger for a moment on Melisandre. The Red Woman, unlike everyone around them, was still calm and collected, as though she feared nothing, and they were not facing down an army of thousands with only a few hundred men. "I am not destined to die in this place," she said, as though knowing what Daenerys was thinking. "And where are you destined to die?" "Loose," Ser Jorah roared, cutting across whatever Melisandre had been about to say. Melisandre smiled softly at her. "The same place you are, princess." Another rumble of thunder, this one overhead, almost made her jump, but she had been expecting it, so simply glanced toward the sky as the first drops of rain began to fall on her head. "Loose." She turned back to look at the Ironborn as they swarmed up the great staircase toward the gates. They had shields raised above their heads, and some of them held ladders that she knew would shortly be pushed up against the walls and used to help them try breach the castle. Another, louder, rumble of thunder and a flash of lightning lit up the skies in the distance. Rain began to fall more heavily, and within seconds her hair was drenched, her braids flat against her head and cheeks. She squinted into the distance over the sea, ignoring the boats that more and more Ironborn sailed from, and tried to work out how long the poor weather might last. The sun was still low in the sky, barely illumining anything but the ships in the harbor and the Ironborn rushing from them. It did not seem like the storm would last long. If it was a true storm, the sort that had plagued the island since her arrival, she would not be able to see the sunrise through the thick clouds. Around her, more and more arrows were loosed, with the soldiers clearly aiming now to hit the soldiers at the side rather than from above. Several Ironborn fell, but more kept coming. The closest men were nearly at the gates now. The rain began to throw itself down heavier now, and large drops splattered against the stone beneath her feet. "We need the dragons," someone yelled. A hand grasped her wrist and spun her around. The dagger that Ser Jorah had given to her earlier rose instinctively, but she dropped her arm as she realized who had touched her. "Let me," Princess Melisandre said. "With your permission." "How?" "Dragons are fire made flesh. And the Lord of Light is fire," she finished in her mind. At the edge of her consciousness, Balerion made himself known, brushing his mind up against her own more forcefully than he had ever done before. She did not even hesitate as she jerked out a stiff nod to the Red Woman and pushed his orders down her bond with her children. Melisandre was gone in an instant, her red cloak whipping out behind her as she descended the steps into the courtyard below and headed toward Daenerys' dragons. "Ixohenos, Tepagan Ahar Osnajolva. Ixohenos, Mzagonilva. Ixohenos, Esizaldsis Ixosvanellerti Persis. Ixohenos, Gaumaganjan Persis Haan. Syt Bantisbri Sir Se Osmnoti Ldys. What is she saying?" A gruff voice said closer to her than she had expected. She did not flinch away from Ser Jorah and instead kept her eyes fixed on Melisandre as her hands rested on her dragons. Balerion and Jairian's eyes remained closed and they were perfectly still, as though asleep, but she could feel their hope and determination flooding through their bond. She is asking the Red God, her Lord of Light, to take my dragon as his own. To save us. Someone nearby snorted. She ignored them and kept her eyes fixed on her children. Behind her she could hear the sound of more and more Ironborn beginning to climb their ladders, their yells and screams of triumph echoing around them. Another faint thump told her another climbing ladder had been thrown against the wall and more were climbing now. They would be swarmed soon if she did not act. Melisandre was still chanting the same words. Steady, men. She turned around suddenly at the sharp clang of steel that was closer than she had expected. Her eyes widened as she watched Ser Jorah ran an Ironborn man through with his sword and then shove him backwards over the battlements. She stepped forward and watched his body as it fell, smashing against the wooden ladder that had been propped against the wall and splintering it, sending dozens of other men to their deaths on the rocky terrain below. More and more men were coming up the steps toward the main gate. She hissed as she saw a huge log being carried between a dozen of them, clear intent they planned to smash the gate down as well as climb the walls, and took a hasty step backwards. Around her, soldiers continued to fire arrows, aiming for those carrying the log. By the 7, they must have sent the entire Iron Fleet, one of the soldiers hissed. More arrows hit the Ironborn. The men behind them did not even stop and instead trampled their fallen comrades. She could see them rushing up through the beach and the docks more quickly now. Those first Ironborn, what felt like hours ago, had been slower, searching the houses and stables and tavern on their hunt for people. But these later ones were ignoring the village and instead focused on the keep. Clearly, they knew there was no one to be found. In the distance she could see more and more rowboats making their way to shore. A roar split the air behind her, and she spun again, turning her back on the advancing Ironborn and watched as her dragons suddenly launched themselves into the air. "Fuck me," the Driftmark soldier that Daenerys had spoken to earlier whispered. She didn't speak but instead tracked the progress of Balerion as he circled around the courtyard, gradually becoming higher and higher above the ground until he swooped over the top of her. His eyes were still the same bright red they always were, but his red scales and the membranes of his wings seemed to be burning as they caught the light of the fires in the torches. He flew over her head, and the heat from him made her take a step back in surprise. Someone yelled. She turned, watching as Balerion flew over the tops of the battlements, circling one last time above the large courtyard. Behind him Jairian gave chase, his wings burning a beautiful cream and gold, and she stared at them as they swooped over the staircase that led down to the harbor, causing the Ironborn still marching up to panic and break formation. "They wait for you, princess." In the distance, her children turned and began to fly back toward the keep. They were only a few feet above the tallest of the Ironborn soldiers now. Dracarys. Jairian's flames shot out first, stronger and more vibrant than she had seen them before, and she watched as they consumed row upon row of Ironborn. The men screamed at the onslaught, and she watched as several jumped off the staircase, tumbling into the darkness below, clearly choosing to risk broken bones over dragon fire. Yet, it was Balerion's flames that gave her pause, and, judging by the sharp intake of breath from others nearby them as well, his flames were a brighter red than she had ever seen, and, even from the distance away she was, she could feel the heat on her face from them. She watched as row after row of men disappeared underneath his flames. She leaned over the battlements and fixed her eyes, squinting against the darkness on the men below. At first, she thought she must be imagining it, or that the darkness was impacting her eyesight to such an extent that she was not seeing clearly, but then she realized she was not imagining it. The stone steps, that formed the only path from the village beneath the castle to the great keep, were beginning to melt. Men were not only being consumed by her dragon's flames, but, even as she watched, some vanished into the darkness below the steps, giving way under them as her child melted stone like it was nothing more than timber. Jairian and Balerion let out twin roars of victory and turned sharply as they drew close to the keep, heading away and back over the staircase. They bathed more and more Ironborn in their flames. The beautiful white and gold flames of Jairian merged with Balerion's black and red ones to create wave after wave of flame that enveloped the staircase, licked down the sides of it and shot into the darkness below. Daenerys could hear men, presumably the ones who had either fallen through parts of the collapsed stairs earlier, or those that had jumped screaming from what seemed like miles below. By the 7, someone breathed nearby. "This is not the work of your 7," Melisandre said, coming to stand next to Daenerys and placing her hands on the edge of the battlements. This is the work of the Lord of Light. Daenerys glanced toward her and was unsurprised to see a tiny smile playing at the edges of Melisandre's mouth. You said you could not wield the flames that your gift lay in visions. I said I could not bring back the dead, Melisandre corrected. Only a few are blessed with such gifts. She opened her mouth to reply, but her attention was caught by the red woman's necklace that seemed to be gleaming with flames of its own. She closed her mouth and turned back to her children. Balerion had headed to the harbor and raced back whilst she had been distracted. Now he turned sharply and headed back around to cast his flames back toward the harbor. Few Ironborn remained on the staircase now, and those that did would not last more than a few more minutes as the flames began to consume them. Nearby, Jaerion was bathing the ladders still propped against the wall in his own flames. In the distance, on the beach and harbor below, fresh Ironborn soldiers continued to try and run toward the keep but were hindered by their burning comrades and the melted stairs. As her gaze traveled across the stone steps, she saw one man try to jump the gap between several melted steps and totter on the edge for a moment before he toppled backwards into the rocky shoreline below. Slowly, the smell of charred flesh began to make its way to her. Sick clawed its way up her throat and she swallowed it back down, her tongue darting out afterwards and sliding against her teeth to try and get rid of the taste somehow. It was a mistake. Instead she ended up inhaling a mouthful of burning flesh smell and ash. She coughed and turned her head to the side to choke out a spittle of food that she had not managed to stop in time. He grimaced at the chunk of meat that she spat onto the ground, and the smell of it, combined with the burning flesh around her, made her cough more. She turned back toward her children as soon as she could and watched as Balerion flew towards the beach. Ironborn soldiers fired arrows at him, most missed but a few bounced off his scales. Several seemed to hit his wings, and a scream ripped from Daenerys' throat before she realized that he had not been hit and instead the arrows had turned to ash before they hit him. The Lord of Light will protect your children. For they are fire made flesh, and they are his. Daenerys tracked Balerion's progress, watching as he ducked and dodged around barrage after barrage of arrows far faster than he ever had been. Nearby, Jaerion turned away from the now burnt ladders and gave chase to follow his brother over the stairs and toward the beach. They unleashed their flames across the beach and dock, burning everything in their path. Even the smallest flicker of flame against something sent it roaring up in a torrent of fire. She took a step back, unable to stop herself, as one of the biggest buildings near the dock caught the edge of Balerion and Jaerion's flames and exploded outwards and upwards in red, black and white gold flames that rose hundreds of feet in the air. Tavern, someone muttered behind her. Screams echoed out before they vanished abruptly, and she knew, instantly, that dozens of soldiers had been consumed by the fire. More and more buildings caught alight, and more explosions sounded out. Her dragons soared across the dock and toward beach, their wings beating slowly and their heads turning to and fro as they bathed as many men as they could in their flames. Through their bond she could feel them begin to tire, for, even though the fight was still not even close to being over, they were still young and untested in battle. Glancing around her, she could tell she was not the only one who could see it. Melisandre was looking at her children with pursed lips, and Ser Jorah was tracking their movements with a frown and tight eyes. The Lord of Light will protect your children, Melisandre said again. But not us, she whispered. We are not destined to die here, Melisandre repeated, her voice even more confident than it had been earlier. Daenerys turned to look at her, and the woman was no longer looking at her children, instead her eyes were fixed on the remains of the tavern in the distance. Daenerys took half a step forward so she could turn slightly and place herself just at the edge of the other woman's vision. Her eyes sought out Melisandre's red ones, and she was unable to stop the hiss that slipped out as she saw nothing but fire in them. She spun away, unable to look any longer, and listened as more and more Ironborn began to storm the beach, impossible to see through the now thick black smoke but easily discernible even above the sound of her dragon's roars and the screams of dying men. The roars of the fresh soldiers were different, full of rage and glee. She shrank back slightly from the battlements, remembering what Lys Baratheon had said about the Ironborn, about what they did. Jaerion suddenly flew overhead, and the force of his wings dislodged the smoke that had been curling around the keep, giving them a chance to see what was happening with more clarity. Thousands of soldiers had appeared on the beach and were running up the main staircase toward the keep. They are circling around. She spun, eyes taking in the shadows of dozens of Ironborn soldiers as they moved across the beach, illuminated by the burning ships behind them and the burning buildings on the docks and small village below the castle. Ser Jorah. At once, Princess. She didn't watch him leave and instead kept her eyes on the Ironborn soldiers as more and more groups broke away from the bulk of the army and began to vanish into the darkness. Jairian raced past her with his mouth open and gold, white and red flames poured out as he flew back over the stone staircase. The sun was beginning to rise more fully in the distance now, with more slithers of daylight discernible over the sea, and she watched the outline of Balerion as he flew over ship after ship letting out blasts of flame that split many in two. Those that did not split in two he raced after again and again, pouring his flames over them until they too began to sink. The rain still poured but less furiously than it had before and, in the sky above, the clouds were beginning to part. She could see fresh clouds on the distance though. This was no passing storm. Suddenly, the clang of steel against steel rang out behind her. She spun, her gaze finding Ser Jorah in the courtyard just as he pushed back against a soldier and slit the man's throat. The man in Baratheon colors dropped to the floor. Ser Jorah's gaze slid past hers and his eyes widened. No. She spun, moving out of the way just in time as one of the soldiers from Dragonstone made to grab her. He toppled, losing his momentum, and flailed for a moment. Next to her, Melisandre moved forward, placed both her hands on the man's chest and pushed. He fell, screaming, sword in hand onto the stone floor of the courtyard below. Run, princess. She ran, darting past soldier after soldier, heading toward the closest staircase to flee to the courtyard. Around her, chaos reigned. She could feel Balerion's terror and anger through their bond, growing stronger as he raced back toward her having picked up on her distress. Nearby, the timber battlements exploded outwards as Jairian flew over the courtyard and let his flames loose. Dozens of men vanished under his flame allies and enemies alike. A man made to grab her even as white and gold flames raced up his leg. She lunged at him, sending them both slamming down onto the ground. The flames on his leg circled up her own, but did no more, so she ignored them whilst he screamed. He tried to grab her again, but she pushed herself back with one hand whilst simultaneously shoving the dagger in her other hand straight into the chink by his armpit. He screamed and let her go. She was on her feet again instantly. A hand grasped at her wrist. With me, princess. Her eyes met the commander of the household guard at Driftmark, but before she could answer he staggered forward half a step, a trickle of blood spilled out the side of his mouth and then his grasp on her wrist went lax. She wrenched her hand free quickly and fled, nearly falling down the stairs in her haste to try and run away from the soldiers who had turned on them. The steps were slicked with rain and her hand gripped the tail tightly as she ran desperate to stop herself tumbling. As she reached the bottom, a man grabbed at her from the side. She darted out the way, scampering backwards on quick, light steps. He lunged for her again and again she darted out the way. The third time, he came at her from the side and threw himself at her, slamming her against the wall. Her head smashed against it and blackness flooded across her vision and, for a few seconds, all she could do was blink stupidly and gasp. His hands wrapped around her hair and made to drag her along behind him. She flailed uselessly for a few moments before her vision began to return and her eyes fixed on a short dagger strapped to his side. She let him drag her, getting as close to him as possible. As soon as she could grasp the dagger she did her fingers wrapping tightly around the hilt. She pulled it free from the scabbard and, even if the chaos around them, he instantly realized what she had done and turned to try to wrestle it from her. It was not him she was aiming for though. Instead, she swung the dagger wildly, slicing through her hair that was spread taut because of his grip on it. The dagger cleaved through it easily and she staggered backwards watching as the man blinked at the handful of her hair that was left in his hand. She didn't give him a chance to recover and instead threw herself at him dagger raised. He roared and made to grab her, but she was faster. She ducked and then jabbed upwards, thrusting the dagger straight into the gap between his helm and the chainmail around his neck. Blood gushed out the wound and he let out a half gurgle, half scream, of agony. He stumbled backwards and she fell with him, blade still lodged in his neck. They hit the ground hard and, even cushioned against him as she was, her knees still slammed against the solid ground and sent reverberations of agony throughout her body. She ignored it and wrenched the dagger back out of his neck and then stabbed down again and again and again until there was nothing left of his neck but mangled, bloody, flesh. Blood clung to her face, and she swiped the back of her arm against her face, trying to wipe the man's blood out of her eyes but all she managed to do was smear it against her cheeks and brow. She used the corpse under her to help push herself up onto her unsteady legs, wrenching the dagger out of the man's throat as she did so. She staggered as she rose to her feet and her legs nearly gave out under her. But she maintained her tight grip on the dagger, refusing to be unarmed. Her vision swam for a moment, and she hacked out another lump of spittle. She ducked a second later as a man's hands grasped at her and shoved her dagger out blindly, not knowing what she hit, only that she had hit something. Whoever had grabbed her let out a scream and did not make to grab her again. She turned away from the man and frantically tried to find Sajora, eyes scanning the courtyard even as black spots threatened to take over her eyesight until she saw his heavy cloak and thick beard. She headed toward him, ducking and weaving as she ran. Through her bond, she could feel Jairian's rage and Balerian's terror. Parts of the battlements exploded in flames as Balerian swooped overhead, but she knew he could do no more for fear of burning her allies, not his fear though, hers. She could not let more men die for her. Not under her dragon's flames at least. She had to protect what allies she had left. Another man grabbed her and tried to pull her toward him, but suddenly another soldier was in front of her, his sword swinging in a clean arc mere inches above Daenerys' head that beheaded the man behind her. She did not pause and kept running across the courtyard as fast as she could to Sajora. She heard her savior swear and fall into step behind her, calling to other soldiers to come to their aid. Around her, more and more men fell into position. A hand grasped hers, a softer one than before, and she realized Melisandre must have fled with her. In the sky above, Jairian circled. She could feel his terror seeping through their bond, and she pushed back at him, urging him to flee to Roigo and Shireen. To protect them. He pushed back against her and only turned away when she forced her will on him. He let loose a roar as he flew away, his anger and grief and terror pouring through. Balerion let out a roar of rage directed at his brother for obeying Daenerys and at Daenerys for making him flee, and vanished behind the wall. She could just see bursts of fire as he lit up the staircase again. It felt like hours, but within mere minutes she was stood behind Sajora and dozens of other soldiers, and small folk men, who had not turned on them. In the distance, she could see blasts of fire and knew that Balerion was trying desperately to stop the Ironborn from breaching the gate. It would be in vain though. She knew it. He could not keep his flames going forever. There was an almighty crash and the gate folded inwards, making large wooden splinters fly everywhere. One of the soldiers that had turned on them took one through the back of his head and it lodged itself out of the front to his eye. She blinked as his blood splattered across her face. He fell to the floor. Behind where he had stood, dozens of Ironborn flooded the courtyard. Balerion appeared above the battlements, circling around to spew more flames on the new arrivals. But then arrows snapped into the side of her dragon and Balerion let out a scream, for that was truly the only way to describe it, of pain, as this time they found their target. Daenerys turned, watching in horror as Ironborn soldiers began to pour out of various doors around the courtyard, having clearly breached the castle in other locations. She spun back to Balerion, watching as thick, dark, drops of blood splattered against the floor, mingling with the rain. "Make him flee," Princess Melisandre whispered urgently, her hand grasping Daenerys' wrist so tightly that she flinched in pain. "The Lord of Light will protect him." "Khaleesi, you cannot," Sajora hissed. She ignored Sajora and fought against Balerion's agony to try and force her will on him. He let out another roar of pain and flapped his wings harder, trying to get away from the soldiers still firing arrows at him. She grit her teeth against the pain as it increased. The more she tried to gain control, until his pain merged with her own, and it was all she could do not to fall to the floor and scream. "Roigo! Flee! Roigo!" Balerion let out another roar of rage and agony and balked against her. His anger at being told to leave her flooded through her for a moment, overpowering his pain and agony, and she shoved her will at him. "Roigo! Flee!" Another roar ripped through the air, but she felt his acceptance flood through their bond for a moment before he withdrew. "He's fleeing!" someone screamed. Her eyes tilted up toward the sky and watched as Balerion climbed higher and higher, letting out a roar of rage as he did so. He disappeared into the last of the clouds, but just before he disappeared from sight, she saw him veer off towards the Dragonmont. Around her she could almost feel the morale amongst those who stood with her plummet, whilst the Ironborn and those that had turned on them crowed their victory. Her eyes met one of the Baratheon men who had lowered his sword and was yelling his victory with the Ironborn. "Why? The words were torn from her throat before she even realized she had said them. Men lose their minds in war, Princess Sajora said quietly, his voice barely discernible above the shouts of victory around them. Men have turned traitor against the own kin for no reason, do not be surprised that they turned on us when they faced death. Despite the confidence of his voice, something clawed at her insides telling her that this was not just men fearing death, they had been too confident in their decision and that Sajora knew that. These men who she had thought had been her allies a mere hour before, had never been her allies, of that, she was sure. ****. Fools, the man behind her said softly. He turned, pulling Daenerys with him, and the knife against her throat cut slightly. She focused on the trickle of blood as it slid down her neck and tried not to listen to the screams and pleas for the men who had turned on her as the Ironborn began to slice their throats. She could not feel pity for them, but the sound of their deaths gave her no pleasure. In the corner of the courtyard, she could see Melisandre and Sajora kneeling down with the rest of the men and small folk. There were Ironborn behind them ready to act should the command be given. It would not though, she knew. They would be tortured until they begged for death. In many ways the traitors had the better death. Sajora's eyes met hers and his tense brows softened slightly. His eyes flicked from her to the men she had been pulled away from, and she realized he must have known exactly what the Ironborn would do. Of course he had. He was a Mormont. A Northerner. Unlike the men who had been on Dragonstone who had made up the bulk of those who had turned, he had been dealing with Ironborn most of his life. He knew them. He knew that those who turned would be put to the sword. It was why he had not fought them. He had only fought until Daenerys could get to him. Let the Ironborn kill them, it gives us more time, his eyes seemed to scream at her. Do not struggle. Panic was clawing at her, but she tried to push it down. In the distance she could see white, gold and red fires on the Dragonmont as Jaerion tried to keep the Ironborn, now climbing up to where she had made her people flee, safe. She could not hear his roars, but his rage trickled down their bond along with fatigue, and she knew that he was tiring. Balerion had reappeared and his red and black flames joined his brothers. Their fatigue brushed against her consciousness so much that it almost felt like it was her own. If it had not been for the magic that Melisandre had wrought earlier, she was sure her dragons would have perished by now. They were too young to have faced such an onslaught for so long. She closed her eyes for a moment and sagged against the man behind her as Balerion's exhaustion overwhelmed her. One of the man's arms circled around her waist and pulled her more tightly against him. He ground himself against her. Her bond with Balerion went taut for a moment, but not because of what was happening to her. He was tense. Something else was happening. Something new. She opened her eyes and glanced up at the sky. Then, abruptly, excitement and relief poured through her bond from her children. A roar echoed down from the Dragonmont. Balerion. She watched his outline as it exploded out, high, above the Dragonmont. His red wings were bathed in flames, and he shot up, high into the sky, before he vanished into the clouds. Jaerion's flames on the Dragonmont continued, and she watched as he unleashed wave after wave of white gold flames on the men she could just see rushing up the hill toward where she knew her son was. Out of the corner of her eye she watched as the birds in the sky and on the roof of Dragonstone suddenly squawked and fled as fast as they could toward the south, and then, finally, she heard the crack of something on the air. Relief washed through her. Her eyes sought out Sajora's and he met her gaze instantly. She blinked once, deliberately, and turned toward Melisandre, whose eyes were back to their normal red with no echo of flames in them. The red woman tilted the corner of her lips up in a small smile and then glanced away. Behind her, the man with his knife to her throat was now barking orders, demanding that the small folk be rounded up, and that any men and boys amongst them be separated. He sounded so full of glee, as though he were enjoying every moment. The knife against her throat slipped slightly and she felt more blood begin to drip down her neck. Abruptly he stopped talking and then jerked her head to the side. There was a brief pause and then something wet and slimy licked the length of her neck. She tensed but otherwise did not react. "I've never tasted a princess before," the man murmured. He licked her again, where he had cut her neck, yanking her head to one side as he did so. His other hand moved down her waist, squeezing her, and he pulled her flush against him. She flinched. A rumble of thunder echoed across the sky and the rain began to pour more heavily. Across the courtyard, Melisandre and Ser Jorah were being pushed against the wall by Ironborn men. One of them tugged at Melisandre's hair, trying to pull her back toward him, but Daenerys watched as she managed to skillfully avoid him by turning at just the right moment, making it look completely natural. Balerion was closer now. She could feel him more clearly than she had for an age. Behind her, the man shoved himself against her again. Suddenly, Melisandre's red eyes met hers and she tilted her head slightly. Her eyes flicked from Daenerys to the man behind her and she smiled. "The next man you lay with will worship you as his queen." She slammed her head back, connecting with his nose. There was a sickening crunch, and she grinned even as he moved slightly to the side and yanked her head back, exposing her neck to him completely. Her eyes met the cloudy sky above before his head loomed over her, his teeth bared in a savage grin. Blood from his broken nose dripped down onto her face and mingled with the already dried blood from earlier in the night. "We're going to have such fun together," he whispered. There was a tugging in her chest and then a swooping sensation before irrational joy flooded through her. The cracks in the air grew closer now, but she was not sure anyone but here could hear them over the rushing of the wind as the storm continued battering the island. Half of her thought that, perhaps, she could only hear the cracks because of her children. It did not matter though. None of it mattered, not anymore. The sound of something split the air, and several men nearby jumped and the man behind her straightened up. Then he laughed. "It was only thunder, you cowards." She smiled to herself. The rain was pouring thick and fast now and, in the courtyard, men were tripping as they ran to and fro, trying to round up those in the keep. She watched as a woman stumbled over, falling to the floor, but before she could rise again an Ironborn had grabbed her by the hair and had begun to drag her across the ground. A roar suddenly rang out, echoing around them. "Dragon!" The man holding her relaxed his grip slightly and then tightened it again. "We've beaten the fucking dragons. They fled," he roared. Her eyes moved away from the courtyard and to the sky. She would see them soon, she was sure of it. Her bond with Balerion was getting stronger as he raced back to her, something faster and stronger than him on his tail, letting him guide them to where Daenerys was. She tilted her head slightly, as much as she could given the knife against her throat, and gazed up at the sky. It took her a moment to place them, and then she did as a flash of lightning lit up the clouds. Balerion's form broke suddenly out of the clouds. He was followed a larger dragon far bigger than him. Big enough to have a rider nestled between the spikes on its back. "Jon." The men around her, and the man behind her, seemed to suddenly realize that something was wrong. They were yelling over the top of each other, but she paid it no mind. Her eyes fixed on the large dragon with its wings pressed tightly against its side. It was descending hundreds of feet at a pace she had never seen before and, suddenly, she realized it was not going to stop, but it was not heading for her. It veered off toward the dragonment. There was a brief pause where all she could hear was the crack of its wings against the air, and then there was a roar and an explosion of flame poured from the dragon's mouth, illuminating the dragonment completely against the dark clouds around. She watched, triumph coursing through her as the Ironborn fighting on the dragonment were lit up, dozens falling under the dragon's flames as it passed over them again and again. Another, more feeble, roar echoed through the night, and then gold and red flames joined the deluge on the Ironborn. She turned her eyes back to Balerion, who had fire building up in his own throat as he raced toward her. The same red flames as before that were, even by the standards of dragon fire, not quite right. Not natural. This time though, she found she did not care. Around her the men continued to scream and panic. The man behind her tightened his grip on her as though he thought it would stop Balerion. She tilted her head up and met the Balerion's gaze. "Dracarys. Fire cannot harm a dragon." The world in front of her exploded into black and red flames that whipped past her, enveloping everyone and everything nearby, faster than anything she had ever seen before. The full blast of her dragon's flames washed over her and she felt her clothes begin to burn away. Despite the heat, she shivered, knowing that she was now bare to those around her who might be able to glimpse her thought the fire. The man behind her caught the edge of Balerion's flames. He screamed and the blade that had been at her neck began to melt, hot metal dripping down against her skin. She gritted her teeth against the pain and wrenched herself free from him, pushing his arm away even as he staggered, to try and force herself away the scalding metal. She stumbled forward as he abruptly released her and took a moment to steady herself as the flames kept roaring past her. She could hear screaming. All she could hear was screaming, and all she could smell was burning flesh and hot metal. She gazed around her, taking in Sajora and Melisandre against one of the walls, her loyal guard pressing the Red Woman against the stone to try and protect her from the flames, as though Melisandre needed protection. The men who had been surrounding them were now burning magnificently and running around in panic as they tried desperately to stop the flames from consuming them. Her eyes turned back to Balerion, who was flapping his wings as he maintained his position above the battlements and poured more flames into the courtyard. More and more men went up in flames, and those that had yet to be hit began to flee, screaming and roaring their anger. Men covered in flames made to run as well, but several fell, the flames proving too much for them, as they ran. Fire raced up their legs and backs, consuming them. One man, near the back of a fleeing group, made to dodge as Balerion suddenly dropped heavily onto the ground in front of him and whipped his neck forward faster than Daenerys had ever seen him, but he was too slow and Balerion's jaws wrapped around the top half of him. Her dragon shook his head, and the lower half of the man's body split away and flew against what remained of the wall. He let out another roar. And a louder one answered it. The bigger dragon appeared from above and circled around the courtyard before it hovered above the battlements. Then, it disappeared from sight for a moment before it landed heavily on the staircase, outside the destroyed main gate. As she watched, the man on its back slid off instantly. He was drawing his sword as he ran back toward the keep. Before he was even under the remains of the gate, the dragon had taken off again and given chase to those fleeing, bathing the staircase in flames so bright that Daenerys had to look away from it. Jon Snow was just as she had expected, dark-haired and grey-eyed, covered in ash and dust, and as furious on the field of battle as his dragon was. An Ironborn man that had been running toward the remains of the gate that Jon Snow entered through paused and made to flee, turning on the spot as though to head back into the keep. She watched, impassively, as her nephew grabbed the man by the shoulder and pulled him back to him, yanked his head back and slashed his sword across the man's throat. Jon did not stop, even as the other man fell. He moved past him and began to cut a path straight toward Daenerys. She turned away from her nephew, catching the form of Sajora out of the corner of her eye as he wrestled a sword away from an Ironborn and slit his throat. She finally stopped turning and fixed her gaze on the man who had grabbed her earlier. She watched as he scrambled backwards away from her, unable to stop the vindictive smile that washed over her face. She took a half step forward to him even as he continued to try and crawl away. "Please." Her head cocked to the side as she tried to remember his name, then she realized she could not, for he had never given it. His helm had begun to melt, fusing to the skin and bone underneath, and he was whining and gasping for air. But still he tried to flee. "Please." She could feel Balerion behind her, his breath hot against her bare flesh and a snarl rumbling through him as he stalked his prey. She caught up to the man easily. Her foot pressed down on what remained of the breastplate molten metal that had, like his helm, fused to his flesh and stopped him scrambling. He froze under her. She looked at the remains of his skin that had already begun to blister a bloody red and then turned her gaze to his face. Her foot pressed more heavily against the breastplate, reveling in the fact that, injured and barely clinging on as he was, he could not throw her off or escape. He let out a moan of pain as she pressed down more heavily. "A shame," she said, eyes fixed on his one good eye. Out of the corner of her eye, she saw Balerion draw level with her. Her hand moved instinctively to rest on his snout, and he let out another angry rumble. His snout burned under her touch. She withdrew her hand. "We could have had such fun." His eyes widened. Dracarys. Chapter 33, Aerys. Chapter text. Chapter summary, Daenerys and Jon meet. Shireen and Stannis reunite. In our interlude, Aemon speaks to Jon of Aerys. Notes, and here we are, Jon and Daenerys finally speak. It's only taken 300k words. 299 AC Daenerys Targaryen. Jon wordlessly approached her as she stood above the burning body of the man who had held her and gave her his thick black and grey cloak. He looked at her with an expression she could not quite decipher and then smiled tightly and vanished into the chaos of the courtyard to take charge. She was left alone in the center of the courtyard for what felt like hours. But, eventually, Sajora had deemed it safe and the two of them dashed through the half-burnt-out keep, through the doors that Lady Shireen and the others had taken hours before, and begun to race up the Dragonmont toward where Jaerion still waited. She knew Roigo was still alive, for Jarian would not have relaxed so if he was not, and she could feel her dragon's victory flowing through her veins. It would not be victory she would feel from him if Roigo was dead. Still, it was not until she saw Shireen Baratheon walking down the hill toward her, with Roigo still clad close to her chest, that her heart finally stopped beating so heavily against her chest. She knew she looked a fright. The blood was crusting on her cheek and forehead now, lingering in the grooves of the lines on her face and the crevices of her cheeks, and she was covered in soot and ash and all manner of debris from the battle. She had caught sight of her reflection as her and Ser Jorah had rushed past a mirror earlier, and hair was ruined beyond recognition with short tufty bits sticking up everywhere as a result of her taking a knife to it in the chaos of the battle. She had seen the looks the men who had survived the sacking of the keep had given her, terror mixed with respect and awe. She was lucky, so lucky. She knew it. She should not have burned that man, so it had echoes of her father that made her uncomfortable because she feared turning into him, but she could not find it in her to regret it. She would do it again if she had to. But she was no fool. She would have to work hard to earn back the trust of the men who had fought alongside her. Yet, her Dothraki would not care. If anything, they would respect her more for it. She had proven herself in battle. And so, as she strode toward them and they down the hill toward her, she smiled sharply at them and watched as their eyes raked over her, taking in her shorter hair, the cloak that clearly was not hers, the blood on her face and the dust and soot over her. Her Dothraki, covered in blood and ash as she was, dismounted their horses as one and walked toward her, their slightly bow-legged steps slightly stiffer than they might usually be. "Blood of my blood," Aggo said roughly. "Blood of my blood," she repeated. "What happened?" "Men." "Fools," Rakaro said loudly. He tossed his braid over his shoulder as he spoke, and for a moment all Daenerys could think was how many more bells he might have on it before this war was won. "We stayed at the top. They came up to us. Easy." She nodded. Of course it had been easy for them. Between their skill with a bow and Jarian, they could have fought double the amount of men and survived. She cast a critical eye over them, taking in their appearances more carefully this time. None of them appeared injured, all the blood on them was their enemies. Her eyes moved to Lady Slyss, a dagger clasped in her hand and a smattering of blood on her own chest, and then to the Maestas and little Montaris Valerian, who all looked uninjured. Above her, she could hear Balerion roar his approval, and Jarian darted past out of the corner of his eye, heading toward the large grey and white dragon in the distance that was burning ships in the bay. Khaleesi, Doriae whispered. "What happened?" "Some of the men turned on us," she said sharply. "They are dead, and the crows will feast well tonight." "Your hair. Who cut your braid?" "I did," she said, glancing away from Doriae to look at her Dothraki, wondering how they would take the news of what she had done. "I took a man's knife from him and used it to cut myself free from him. He is dead." She nodded. "By my hand." Rakaro bit out something quietly that made the others around them grumble, but Daenerys ignored it, knowing that the insult was not offered toward her, despite the gruffness of his tones and the way his eyes flickered over the remains of her hair with disgust. She had proved herself in their eyes, for even if she had cut her braid, she had won a great battle with them. "We shall braid it tonight," Doriae said after exchanging a look with Rakaro. "You won a great battle today, Khaleesi." She smiled, nodding towards Doriae and the others. Then she glanced, finally, toward her son, who held out his pudgy arms toward her. Shireen took a step forward and relinquished him into her arms. She closed her eyes, pressed a kiss against his head and breathed in the smell of him. ****. She watched as her Aggo and Ser Jorah spoke in low tones nearby. Both men were now fully bathed, although Aggo still looked a bit dirty to her critical eye, but she knew that trying to convince him to bathe more properly was futile, and clad in clean clothes. A passing glance at them would make anyone skeptical of the battle that had taken place mere hours before, for they seemed relaxed and at ease. Yet, she could see from the way both had their hands on their weapons and their eyes flickered around the courtyard erratically, taking in the Baratheon soldiers who had not turned, the small folk who had survived, and the iron-born prisoners who had been clapped in irons and awaited judgment, that they were still expecting a fight. Both of their gazes cut toward her, and she inclined her head at them, waiting for them to break eye contact, which they did. She stood alone at the top of the stone stairs that led down to what remained of the harbor. But a few paces in front of her, the staircase had collapsed, and if she knew that if she leant forward slightly, she would see piles of charred bone partially crushed by the fallen stone. She did not lean forward again and instead watched as the ships in the distance drew closer. Mandaeally banners. She sighed, closed her eyes and hugged her son more tightly to her chest. In the back of her mind she could feel her dragons, fatigued but still full of that same boundless joy from earlier in the day when the other dragon had appeared, as they tried to relax but likewise struggled. They were in the Dragonmont, having had their fill of fallen soldiers with the white and grey dragon. There was a pang of longing that shot through their bond suddenly and she stifled another sigh, knowing what it was. She opened her eyes and spun on the spot, turning away from the charred remains of the village below and the blue sea clouds now vanished from sight and headed back into the destroyed keep. Her eyes raked over the iron-born prisoners as she walked past, and she was unable to stop the curl of her lip or the frown that split across her face. If she had her own way they would already be dead for what they did to the small folk. But she was not a Khaleesi here and she was not a queen. Their fates would fall to Jon. She glanced around her, looking for her nephew, but could not find him anywhere. It had been like this for hours, her lurking on the edge of the courtyard, or at the top of the steps, waiting for him to appear and Jon not being anywhere. She knew he was here somewhere. Eventually, as the first of the rowboats began to drop from the Mandaeally galleys and make their way toward the coast, she decided she would find her nephew herself rather than wait for him to come to her. It took but a few moments to wave off the concerned looks of Ser Jorah and Aggo and make her way inside the keep following the directions of various soldiers and servants who told her that Jon had headed inside. She headed up dozens of flights of stairs, stopping on her way to give Roygo to Shireen and Doriae, and then detoured past her own chambers to make sure the damage had not been too significant. It took, perhaps, an hour before she reached the top of the stone drum approached the door that led to the chamber of the painted table. She paused outside, took a deep breath and then pushed the door open. Her eyes flicked over the room quickly, taking in the huge painted table where she and others had planned their defense of Dragonstone, the hearth in the corner and the iron brazier that still smoldered from days before. But she did not pause there, instead her gaze turned to Jon who was stood at one of the huge glassless windows that provided a perfect view of the Mandaeally rowboats as more and more of them docked in the remains of the harbour. Jon jumped as the door slammed shut behind her as a gust of wind caught it. He spun as he jumped and turned to look at her. Daenerys did not jump, for she had expected the door to slam eventually and announce her presence but instead regarded her nephew carefully. He averted his gaze as soon as their eyes met and she huffed out a sigh of irritation. She crossed over the room to stand next to Jon and faced out toward the harbour and sea in the distance. It was not lost on her that this was the same position she had stood in only a few days before with Slyss Baratheon. Next to her, Jon stiffened and then turned to face the sea as well. His eyes resolutely fixed on the galleys in the distance rather than the smouldering wreckage of the Iron Fleet. Roygo. She glanced toward Jon, surprised at how brusque his voice was, a thick, heavy accent as dissimilar from the Dothraki rumbles as it was from Lady Sliss's careful words, and tried not to take offense that he was still staring at the sea and not looking at her. "My son is well," she replied. "Lady Shireen has him in her chambers." When he did not reply she turned slightly to look at him. "I thought we might dine together this evening, us three." Jon opened his mouth, as though to refute her request, and then closed his mouth again. A pained grimace flickered across his face before it instantly vanished and he said, "I would like that." "Your face suggests otherwise," she snapped. "What is it about me that you find so displeasing, nephew? I did not think you one to balk from justice. You burned more men this morn than I did." When Jon made an aborted movement, realization swept through her. "It was not my burning of that man that made you uncomfortable." Jon flushed again and jerked his head in a short nod. "Then we shall not speak of it," she said softly. "Let us pretend it did not happen." Jon, finally, turned to look at her. A flush crept across his cheeks but his eyes met hers and she was pleased to see he no longer looked uncomfortable but instead seemed to have relaxed slightly. His eyes stayed locked on hers for a few moments and then he smiled at her, soft and gentle. It made his eyes crease up as well whilst softening his brow, and instantly she thought that all her hopes about him had been right. He had not been ignoring her because he was disgusted by her. She smiled back. "Viserys said you could not burn," he said eventually, finally breaking eye contact, another light flush on his cheeks that she pretended not to notice. "It was the first time I tested it with Balerian's flames," she admitted. She paused and glanced out toward the sea, unable to look at Jon as she asked, "How is my brother?" Well, John replied quickly. Then, clearly realizing that she did not quite believe him, he pressed on in a voice that tinged on anger but was not quite so furious. He was honest with me about what had happened. Some would say, mayhaps, too honest. He's my brother. And my uncle, John said softly. There was something in the tone of his voice that made her look toward him again. He was gazing at her with a twist to his mouth that she could not place properly, but she did not think it was sympathy nor rage, more understanding. When his eyes met hers, they softened slightly again and he quirked his lips in a small half-smile that told her that he did understand, and they need not speak of it. Thank you, she whispered eventually. He nodded and turned away again to look at the bay. In the distance, Balerion swooped past with Jarian giving chase, both of them following the larger form of John's dragon. They will be big enough to ride soon, John said a few moments later. The cream one is likely big enough to take a small rider now. I had the same thought, she admitted. It is why I sent him to them during the battle. Would he have taken her? If she had Roigo, yes. But he would not have taken Monteris with Roigo. No. John nodded. I had suggested a betrothal between her and Viserys. Viserys is amenable. It would be wise, even if she cannot claim one for herself, to reintroduce the blood, she agreed. She will be good for him in a few years. He needs someone who is kind and will wish to make him happy. Someone who will have the strength to stand up to him but will not look to use him for their own purposes. Someone who can focus on him, and he can focus on them in return and know that they are his. Some would claim that makes her sound like a possession. Are wives not possessions for their husbands? She asked softly. I would hope my wife, when I take one, would be my equal. You are not yet betrothed. John shook his head, not turning to look at her. I am yet to find a match that feels appropriate, given the circumstances. And me? She whispered. If you wish to marry, then Viserys and I will help you find a man that is worthy of you. And if I did not? John turned to look at her, spinning on the spot so abruptly that she took half a step back. I will not force you, he said softly. His hand raised and then dropped slightly as though he thought better of touching her. That is not how it works for women, she replied a few minutes later, once the dragons had vanished into the distance. I must marry, for you, for House Targaryen. I know that. I will do my duty, nephew. If it is a good man, who will not shun Roigo and will treat me well, then I would marry for our house. You have done your duty, John replied sharply, his voice rising as he spoke. Viserys and I are in agreement on this. Then we shall not speak of it anymore, she replied. She was no fool. But she would not fight him on this, not now. I asked that Wendell Marndale and Theon Greyjoy be brought up here by Lady Sliss once they arrive. Wendell has almost as shrewd a mind as his father and Theon is learning his craft, John said a few moments later. I likewise wish for you and the Maestas to join us. The Red Woman too, I heard of what she did to your dragon and Lady Sliss. The rowboats were already beginning to dock when I left to find you an hour ago, she replied, glancing at the sun that was now far past the halfway point in the sky and was beginning to sink down again. They should be here within minutes. So, if I wish to speak to you privately, I should do so now. Yes. I imagine you will wish to leave on the morrow. War waits for no man. Not even for a king, John replied mildly. But there is nothing I wish to say to you, Daenerys. Only that I am glad to finally meet you and I look forward to dining with you and Roigo tonight. She smiled. And I am glad to meet you as well, nephew. Asterisk asterisk. Theon Greyjoy looked far too like the man who had held her against him earlier that day for her to find herself at ease in his company. She supposed he was handsome, with blue eyes the same unnerving shade as the man who had held her earlier and dark hair with a thin face but wiry arms and legs that told her that he had a hidden strength. He held himself in a similar way as well, like a predator watching his prey. Yet, he had greeted John as a brother, the two men striding across the room to each other the second Sliss Baratheon had opened the door, and embracing emphatically with great slaps on the back and whispered words in the ear and named him such. Despite knowing little of her nephew, she could not imagine he would name a man brother if he was unkind or vicious. Still, she could not help but take half a step back as he approached her. His eyes tightened slightly, and his lips pursed for a moment, clearly recognizing the look on her face, but almost immediately his face relaxed again, and he kept walking. He stuck out his hand as he approached her, and it took a few moments for her to realize she should offer hers for him to kiss the back of it. "I heard I have you to thank for ridding the world of my uncle," he said by way of introduction once he had placed a feather-light kiss to the back of her hand. His face was relaxed and open, and there was a devilish smile on his lips. "Death by fire for a drowned man is a cruel way to go. I can only hope he suffered for it. There is not a man in Westeros who deserves a more painful death than Euron Greyjoy." "He suffered," she said softly. A small smile flickered over her lips. "I cannot think of anything worse than being beaten by a girl." Theon's tongue darted out and licked his lips, then he laughed. Nearby she could hear the low rumble of voices, and she glanced away from Theon and toward the other newcomer. Her eyes raked over the man that was nearly 3 times the width of Theon, with a large moustache but no hair, and a thick, heavy sword hung about his waist that seemed not to bother him at all. She hid a flinch as she realized there was some food in his moustache, although the rest of him was spotless, including his pristine armor that had a merman inscribed upon it. "Wendell Mondaly." He turned away from Jon, who he had been speaking to, and approached her. Theon moved out of the way as he approached and headed toward Jon and began speaking in hushed whispers. He stopped slightly further away than Theon had and cocked an eyebrow, his eyes moving up and down her carefully. It was unlike any look she had received before, evaluating and calm, not an inch of lust in his eyes. She liked him. "Daenerys Targaryen," he greeted. His voice was quiet, but she had the impression he had made it so, for he seemed to be concentrating carefully on what he was saying as though he did not wish to give offense. "The men here speak highly of you." She smiled at him, pleased that he had managed to make the comment sound like he was giving her a compliment rather than passing judgment. "Wendell Mondaly. My nephew speaks highly of you." "I, a flatterer, he is our king," Wendell replied, his voice booming now as though he no longer felt necessary to try and take care with how he spoke. "I speak as a find," Jon said, coming up behind Wendell to stand next to Daenerys. "From what Theon has just told me, House Mondaly has proved itself 100 times these last moons. If I had known but a few minutes ago, when I spoke of you to Daenerys, what I know now, I would have been even more effusive in my praise." She watched as Wendell Mondaly flushed a bright red, his cheeks pinkening to a shocking shade. "Beware the hidden depths, Your Grace," Wendell said loudly, straightening under Daenerys' inspection. Jon agreed. "Come, Elwood, hear of what else has happened since I saw you last." Daenerys stood slightly to the side, not quite knowing where to go as those gathered began to take their places at the table. Theon and Wendell Mondaly moved to the right of Jon, prime positions at the head of the table as though they belonged there. Slyss Baratheon and the Red Woman took the left, closest to Daenerys, but did not leave space for her. The 2 Maesters took their places as well, one either side of the table. She made to move to join Maester Cressen, who stood by Slyss Baratheon, but a hand caught her wrist and she stopped. They were hidden by the edge of the painted table, so she knew that no one could see that Jon had grabbed her, but for half a moment a flush of embarrassment crept over her. He squeezed her wrist gently once and then let go and moved to stand at the top of the table. After a brief pause, less than a second in truth, she moved to join him. She thought for a moment that someone might comment, but instead all eyes flicked from her to Jon and everyone waited for him to speak. "The Lannister army is gone," Jon began. "Not even 10 days ago their forces were decimated at Riverrun. Most of the Knights of the Vale, the North, the Riverlands and the Reach ride to King's Landing under the command of my uncle, Prince Viserys." She ignored the rest of what Jon was saying. Jon had made it clear that he and Viserys had spoken and that he had willingly accepted Viserys as his family. Yet, she still had not expected such trust to have been placed in Viserys, for she knew it was trust. Jon was aware of Viserys' history, and he had seen fit to leave him in command of his army regardless. Viserys must have proved himself to Jon in some way and, more importantly, Oren must have believed that Viserys posed no risk, for she knew if Oren thought Viserys was a risk to Jon that he would not have allowed such a development. And the North. She pulled her attention back to the present and watched as Wendell Mondaly turned to Theon Greyjoy, a proud smile on his face, and waited for him to speak. "Petyr Baelish was in White Harbor," Theon began quietly. "Pardon?" "He is dead," Theon said quickly, leaning forward and placing both hands on the painted table. His voice dropped slightly and grew more earnest as he spoke. "He is dead. And his plots, his attempts to try and convince Roose Bolton's bastard to turn against Winterfell and to secure the support of Lysa Arryn have either been thwarted or they will be. Do I wish to know? Something in Jon's voice made her turn slightly so she could look at him out of the corner of her eye. She was surprised to realize he seemed curious, at least judging by the slight cock of his head and the confused expression on his face, rather than angry or concerned. He was not angry Petyr Baelish was dead, nor that Winterfell might be at risk, but more curious as to how the man had died. It wasn't the sort of curiosity Viserys might have once had, more a question of how it had been done. Drowning, Theon said eventually, his eyes locked on Jon and his mouth set. Jon gave Theon a small, half-smile, and then nodded. Winterfell are aware. Lord Wyman is exchanging ravens with Lord Willers, and I believe Sansa is also aware. They are unconcerned. Very well, Jon replied. We shall speak more of this later. When Theon jerked his head once, Jon turned slightly and looked at Lord Wendell. We must plan for King's Landing. You know my thoughts on this, Your Grace. And I agree. We cannot set the dragons loose on the city. You do not wish to take King's Landing by force. She turned towards Lys Baratheon, who had spoken. It was the first words she had heard from the woman since before the siege. The woman was resolutely not looking at Daenerys, although she must have felt the weight of her gaze on her, but instead was staring at Jon unblinkingly. Eventually, Daenerys turned her gaze back to the painted table and looked at the figures that were placed on it. I would prefer not to. And your armies? You said they march there. They do, Jon agreed. But that is to try and pressure the Lannisters into releasing King's Landing, not that I believe they will do so. My husband has a man in his employ, you have met him before, Lys said after a few moments. Sir Davos Seaworth. He was a smuggler. He has spent much time in King's Landing over the years. He may well know a way in that others do not. Then I will need to fly to Bronze Egget, Jon agreed. Lord Wendell, Theon, take the ships to blockade King's Landing. You should take Lady Shireen with you, she murmured, struggling to find her voice for a few moments. Her eyes raised from the table, and she turned to Jon. Lord Stannis may well welcome the news that his daughter is safe, but if he can see her again, be sure that she is safe. It will give him and the Stormlands more confidence in supporting you. You will have proven your word. I agree, Lys said, speaking loudly before Jon could even open his mouth. If my husband asked for you to come for Shireen, then you should take her with you, so he knows you kept your word. Ladies Lys and Princess Daenerys are right, Maester Cresson said gently, his voice soothing and coaxing like a man who was used to dealing with strong personalities who did not always wish to take advice. To hear Shireen is safe is one thing, but to see it with his own eyes and for his men to see it, to know that their king answered a call for aid, that is worth 1,000 stories, Your Grace. Besides, I think it best if we leave this place. We should sail with your fleet. Best not linger here now that the keep is so destroyed and so many have died. We cannot deplete your forces by asking that some men remain with us to help garrison it. Prince Viserys rides at the head of the Northern, Riverlands and Vale forces. Your Grace rides at the head of the Stormlands and any Crownlands houses that have come to your aid. Princess Daenerys should sail at the head of your fleet. 299 AC Jon Snow. He's so quiet, he murmured, watching as one of the women who had come from Essos with Daenerys left the room with Rhaego tucked in her arms. Daenerys smiled softly at the back of the woman's head as the woman ducked out the room and then closed the door softly behind her. He's always been quiet, she said eventually. Even as a babe a few days old, he rarely cried. He nodded and leaned forward and poured some more wine into both their mugs before he pushed Daenerys' mug slightly back toward her and took a deep swig from his own. She watched him carefully as she drank deeply, her eyes flicking over him. He tried not to stare back at her and instead let her evaluate him, knowing that it was more interest than judgment that drove her. What will become of him? Daenerys' voice was so quiet it took him a moment to realize she had even spoken. Her hands were wrapped tightly around her mug of wine and her eyes were, for the first time in their conversation, not fixed on him but instead on the table between them. He's a Targaryen, he began softly. His blood. I do not care who his father is, and I do not think the lords of Westeros will care either once he takes Jaerion as his mount. So, I imagine what will become of him is he lives with you until he is of age and then one day, if he wishes, finds a good match and marries. You will not send him away, or hide him. Never. They'll call him a bastard, Daenerys whispered. They won't consider him a true Targaryen, not given who his father was and not given our marriage was not in West AOC customs. She glanced away from the table and up at him, her eyes wet. I did not truly think about it before, but it's all I think of now. I see the way the servants here look at him. I am no fool. I did not think you were, he murmured. He leaned forward and put his mug down on the table but did not straighten up and instead kept leaning toward Daenerys. I cannot stop them speaking of him, nor of you if they wish to, but it will not change the life he will have. It is one thing to be a bastard from a great house with no great future to look forward to, no chance to have children of your own, to know that you are your family's shame and to be reminded of that every day. To be an outsider looking in. But Rhaegar will not have that. He is a prince. He is a Targaryen. He will be a dragon rider. You were a bastard. For years he agreed, knowing that Daenerys did not know the truth of his birth but was acknowledging that it was different now because he had winter. When Daenerys glanced up to look at him, eyes wet and mouth downturned, he gave her a wry smile. Ned Stark loved me. But I knew what my future was, and it was never to have my own family because if I did, my children might one day seek to claim Winterfell. I sat with the squires when Robert Baratheon came to Winterfell. Do not mistake my words, I had a good life at Winterfell. Better than many bastards go. But I was still a bastard in the eyes of many. I am still a bastard, but I have a dragon now. It has made a difference. So, please believe me when I say Rhaegar will not have that. I mean it, Daenerys. He will sit at our table. He will ride a dragon. He will marry well. He will father children of his own. He is family and I will not see it any other way. He'll still be a bastard in their eyes, Daenerys said softly. But he will be loved. He'll be loved. He didn't expect Daenerys to reply, so he was not surprised when she did not and instead leaned back in her chair and heaved out a deep sigh. He took a moment to look at her properly. It was the first examination of her he had allowed himself to do since he had first seen her earlier that day, covered in ash and debris and blood with her hair matted and chopped roughly to her shoulders and completely naked. He felt his face flush as he remembered it and instead focused more carefully on her again. She was slim but strong. Stronger in appearance than Viserys was, with arms that clearly showed muscle from hard work and days on horseback likely from her time with the Dothraki, and he knew that her legs were similarly muscled. Her eyes, he knew, were violet just as Aemon's were but a slightly different shape to both Aemon and Viserys. Where Viserys had silver blonde hair, Daenerys was silver gold. She was undeniably beautiful. Ferocious too. Your eyes are similar to Viserys. He jolted forward slightly, embarrassed to have been caught staring. My apologies. Daenerys grinned at him, her face looking younger than it had earlier. There is no need to apologize, nephew. You were looking for familiarity, I take it. Did you find any? None, he replied, feeling a tinge of remorse. You look like Viserys, but only so much as siblings look like each other. She nodded. You have the same jaw as Viserys. She paused. But nothing else. Viserys has Aemon's eyes. Truly. The same shape, the same color, everything. Daenerys smiled softly. He will be pleased, she murmured. He has always said he did not look like mother. But you did. He inferred. Daenerys nodded and leaned forward against. I have her eyes. Viserys, he struggled with that. My father Ned Stark said I look like my mother, Lyanna. I have her eyes, he found himself saying quietly. I sometimes think it is why he found it hard to look at me. ***. Will you tell me of Sir Davos? Sir Onion Knight is my friend, Shireen said quietly, looking up at him with wide blue eyes. She chewed slightly on the edge of her lip, as though worried she had spoken too much and may have caused offense. Abruptly her eyes whipped away from him and fixed on Winter in the distance. They were stood at the edge of the cliffs on Dragonstone, waiting for Winter to finish her meal and come to them so they might leave the island and head towards Bronze Egget. I do not plan on hurting him, Lady Shireen, he replied gently. Although I am glad he has found such a friend in you. I merely wished to know more of him. I am afraid I know very little about the man who is your father's closest ally. Shireen flushed slightly and turned her face down to the ground for a moment. He is kind. The other lords look down on him because he was born in Flea Bottom. He pretends it doesn't bother him, but it does. But he is kind. And he is smart. Father once said he wished he had more men like Sir Davos. I wish I had more men like Sir Davos, he murmured. He spoke most fondly of you. Shireen was quiet for a moment and then she said, speaking so rapidly the words tumbled out of her mouth, Mother said I am betrothed to your uncle, Prince Viserys. That it was part of the offer you made Sir Davos in exchange for father bending the knee. It was he agreed, seeing no reason to lie to the girl. If you both agreed to it, and your father agreed. I am not sure if he did. Princess Daenerys Dothraki spoke of Prince Viserys, Shireen whispered. They mock him and say he is foolish and cruel. I suppose they met a different Viserys to me, he said eventually. But, I give you my word, if you do not wish to wed him, if you think him foolish or cruel, or even if you simply do not like him, then I will not make you marry him. Your father will still be my ally. Shireen did not reply, but he saw the tension ease out of her shoulders slightly. He watched as her eyes rose from the ground beneath their feet and tracked the movement of Winter as she uncurled herself from around the whale carcass she had been eating, stretched her wings and launched into the air. Shireen's face paled slightly, and she glanced down again. You do not need to come with me, Lady Shireen, he said quietly. I would be glad to take a note to your father from you. He may believe it written under pressure, Shireen replied. If I come with you, he will know that I am safe, and your alliance will stand. When Jon did not speak, she continued, and I want to see him. And he will be glad to see you, I am sure. Shireen's face twisted slightly, and her nose wrinkled before she could likely stop herself. Perhaps, Your Grace. He wrote to me, when he heard that Dragonstone may face the Ironborn alone. He wrote and asked for me to come to your aid. I am his heir. You are, he agreed. But new heirs are easily made. He asked a great service of me to risk taking on the Iron Fleet alone with no support. He knew when he asked that I could say no, that I might say no, and that many would have said no. Certainly, many of the lords counseled against me coming for you. You had to come. Princess Daenerys is here. Daenerys is here. Rhaego is here. You are here, he said gently. Even if Daenerys and Rhaego were not here, I would have come for you. I promised Sir Davos that even if your father did not bend the knee that I would see you safe. Shireen looked up at him, her eyes slightly wet, and he smiled down at her. Thank you. Fathers are difficult, he murmured, echoing the words that Aemon had said to him over a year ago. But we love them anyway, and they us. Shireen smiled back at him, a weak and watery smile, but a stronger one than he had yet seen from the girl. She made to open her mouth to reply, but Winter landed heavily a few feet away and she snapped her mouth shut again. We should leave. She nodded at him and took half a step toward Winter, her face slightly pinched and her eyes wide and wary. When Winter twitched her neck slightly in Shireen's direction, as though she were a dog cocking its head in confusion, and then let out a gentle puff of smoke, the girl seemed to gain confidence and crossed the distance between him and Winter in a few strides. He heaved the bag more carefully onto his shoulder and followed. It took a few moments for Shireen to clamber onto Winter's back and settle down between one of the spikes. He followed her, clambering on behind her and carefully adjusting the bag so it was between him and Shireen, mindful that he did not wish to lose the wineskin contained within, nor the salted meats that they had been given to last them the journey. Ready? Shireen jerked out a sharp nod, her legs tightened noticeably around Winter's side and her fingers went white with the force of her grip on Winter's spikes. Through their bond he felt Winter's amusement and slight offense that the girl was clearly so terrified of her, but Winter did not move and instead waited for Jon's command. Svegon. He had expected Winter to launch herself into the air, but she did not. Instead, she crouched down first and then bounded across the short distance between where she had been and the edge of the cliff, and then she launched herself off the edge, wings tucked in, and let them plunge 100 feet in seconds. Abruptly her wings fanned out and their dive stopped, and Winter leveled off and glided above the sea. A few harsh beats of her wings later and she had carried them up at least 50 feet. In front of Jon, Shireen let out a laugh of joy. They soared over the Mandaeali ships docked in the bay, and he glanced down and watched as dozens of sailors ran around, readying the ships to leave as soon as the Red Wine fleet arrived. A roar sounded to their right, and he turned toward the noise and watched as Balerion and Jaerion appeared from above, flying next to Winter as she headed further out to sea. The two smaller dragons stayed with Winter for an age before they turned, as one, and headed back toward Dragonstone. **** The journey from Dragonstone to Bronze Egg took slightly longer than the journey from Riverrun to Dragonstone, mostly because Winter had to stop more frequently, the weight of two passengers fatiguing her even more than Jon thought it would. Even as we guided Winter in a circle around the encampment and castle below, encouraging her to circle twice before flying off toward the eastern edge to land, he could feel her fatigue through their bond. In front of him, Shireen's hands gripped the white spikes so tightly that he thought she might never be able to let go again. There was a brief jolt as Winter landed, as exhaustion took over her for a moment and her legs buckled. He knew it had taken much for her to carry two people across the sea. He had not been lying to Viserys all those weeks before when he said she was not yet ready for them both. Under him, Winter shook for a moment as though to dislodge something, and then she let out a gentle rumble that told him she wished for him to dismount so she might sleep. He ran a hand down her neck and loosened the arm he had wrapped tightly around Shireen's waist. In front of him, Shireen remained tense, her back straight and her eyes fixed on Winter's spikes. He knew that she was not scared of Winter, however. "Remember what I said, Lady Shireen," he said softly. "Your father asked for aid. He asked for me to come for you. He would not have done that if he did not care for you." In front of him, Shireen relaxed a fraction but still did not lift her eyes. He sighed and shifted, sliding one leg over the back of Winter's spikes carefully, and then carefully climbed down to her leg and jumped the short distance to the ground. He wobbled slightly as he did the days on her back, having made his legs cramp, but quickly regained his stride. On Winter's back, Shireen remained half frozen for a minute before she too carefully dismounted. Once they were both off, Winter turned slightly and bumped Jon once with her snout and then did likewise with Shireen. "Thank you," Shireen whispered. He watched as Winter bumped her snout against Shireen again and then turned around and threw herself down, curling up into a ball, and seemed to fall asleep instantly. Shireen let out a nervous giggle. Together they turned and gazed at the encampment in front of them. Even from the distance away they were, he could see men running around and trying to wrangle horses back under control. In the distance, some had bolted and men on horseback had given chase. It seemed to be chaos. Yet, despite all that, there was a group of men striding toward them, cutting a line straight through the encampment and walking fast. He squinted and brought his hand up to his eyes to try and shielded them against the bright sunlight, and then smiled. "It appears your father and Sir Davos are already on their way." Next to him, Shireen's head snapped around from where it had been turned to watch the men giving chase to the bolting horses. She stumbled slightly and he snagged an arm out to grab her to stop her falling. Once he was confident that she would not fall again, he released her and turned his attention back to the approaching men. They were out of the encampment now, at least a dozen of them striding quickly toward him. At the front, one man was walking faster than the others. He was nearly bald, and the sunlight almost seemed to reflect off his head, but with a dark black beard that identified him easily. "Father!" Shireen bolted suddenly and her nervousness vanished in an instant as she began to run across the empty space between Winter and the encampment. He watched her go with a small smile on his face and slowed his own steps to give him more time alone with her father. His eyes moved from her to Stannis Baratheon, and, for half a moment, he thought the girl's father might not greet her as enthusiastically as she would greet him. He was wrong though. There was no strangled scream like Shireen had given when she yelled for her father, but suddenly Stannis Baratheon was no longer striding toward them but was instead running, his cloak billowing out behind him and the sword strapped to his side clanging against his armor, not that he seemed to notice it. Jon smiled to himself as he watched the man drop to his knees just before Shireen slammed into him. He had heard about Stannis Baratheon. He knew what sort of man the lords of Westeros claimed him to be, harsh, unyielding and a man of pure duty. And, from everything Daenerys had said, he had half feared he was making a mistake in taking Shireen to see her father after all that had happened, and he worried that Stannis was not capable of showing Shireen the affection she needed. He had never been gladder to be wrong. Shireen was pressed tightly against her father, arms thrown around his shoulders, and Stannis Baratheon was hugging her back just as tightly with his own arms cradling her close to him and his nose buried in her hair. As Jon drew closer, he more closely examined the man who had called for aid. He was nearly bald, although there was a close cropping of dark hair around his ears that was the same color as his thick beard. He was strong with broad shoulders and thick legs and clad in armor, despite the heat, with a sword on one hip and what looked like several daggers on the other. Abruptly, he realized the man was looking at him as his eyes met the other man's deep blue ones. There was a brief pause where they looked at each other, and then Stannis Baratheon pulled his head slightly away from his daughters and jerked his chin in a deferential nod. Had it come from any other man, Jon would have taken it for an insult, but he knew that coming from this man it was more than that. And so, he smiled at the man on his knees and jerked his head back toward Shireen and crossed past the two of them to greet Davos Seaworth. Interlude, 298 AC Aemon Targaryen. What do you know of Aerys? My grandfather. Jon asked rhetorically, leaning back against the stone hearth and holding out his arms so the little dragon could scamper into it. Only once she was settled, her legs pressed up against Jon's chest and her head resting on his shoulder whilst the rest of her curled up to his stomach like a common cat, did Jon continue, only what he did and simply rumors at that. Father would never speak of it. He nodded to himself, unsurprised that Ned Stark had kept so much from Jon. To lose so much to one man would make even the strongest man wish not to speak of him. But still, he sighed to himself. Not for the first time, Ned Stark's reluctance to discuss Jon's history and heritage meant that Jon was woefully unprepared and undereducated about so much. He could not blame the man, but he had not expected so much to fall to him to tell Jon. Shall I tell you of him? There must have been something in his tone, for Jon's eyes shot up from the dragon to fix on him. His mouth opened for a moment before he snapped it shut again and jerked out a sharp nod. He nodded to himself and shuffled slightly under his bedding. Ghost opened his eyes and glowered at him but, eventually, obliged and moved slightly out of the way so that Aemon could pull up more covers. As soon as he leaned back against his pillows, Ghost threw himself back down with his head on Aemon's lap, closed his eyes and appeared to go straight back to sleep. I never met him, he began carefully. But many men have told me of him, and my nephew once wrote to me of him as all fathers are wont to do of their children. As a child, he was reported to be charming, active, happy, enjoyed all the things a future king should enjoy, and he was handsome. Some would have said that he was perfect. But even then there were things that would make someone, who was not a parent, worry. Some of the men that have come here since then, who are long dead now, reported that he was not intelligent and was quick to take slight and anger. I am afraid that the latter has always been something our family have suffered from. We can become irrationally angry in a heartbeat. The blood of the dragon, my father called it. But Aerys, he was different. I never met him, so I cannot put my finger on what it was, but men who did meet him said that he was obsessed with having more children, and he was fiercely protective of both Rhaegar when he was young, and then Viserys after. And Rhaegar, well, she lost many children in the birthing bed. He paused, wondering where to go next. How many? 7, that I know of. Jon sucked in a breath, his eyes going wide. Surely that cannot be the norm, uncle. It is not, he agreed softly. But I do not think any man or woman would be so foolish as to cause those deaths, Jon, if that is what you are thinking. 1 or 2 children would be one thing, but 7 is quite another. Is that why he went mad? I believe it was a contributing factor, he mused. To only have one son live, to say his first words, at least until Viserys was born, it is a pain I would not wish on anyone. Whatever the reason was, and we could speculate until the end of time, the more children that Aerys and Rhaegar lost, the madder he became. He had his mistresses tortured and then murdered, along with their families. Wet nurses likewise. But then Viserys was born, and he lived, and where people hoped Aerys might show some improvement, he did not. He grew more paranoid. He paused again and looked at Jon. I suppose you know of the Defiance? Jon nodded. I know. A terrible thing. I do not tell you this to try and make you sympathize with him, Jon, he cautioned softly. Aerys was mad even before Duskendale, and there is no excuse for what he did before and after. He was, Jon agreed. He nodded. He was. But, as with all things, there is a question of nature and nurture. How much of what Aerys became was because of him, and how much of it was because of what happened to him? Had his children lived, would he have become so mad? Had the defiance of Duskendale not happened, would he have become so mad? Certainly, I would like to think that although he was not stable and he was not healthy, that what happened to him over the course of his life changed him. He was not a good man. But sometimes, bad men are made not born. They are a product of the life they have lived, the rejections they have faced, the loves they have lost, the grief they carry and the memories that torment them. Do you believe that, uncle? He paused and considered John carefully. I certainly like to think that, if things had been different, he might have been a good king. He might have been a man that I could have been proud to call blood. That is the folly of blood, John. No good man ever wishes to think badly of their blood. They will seek to explain their actions until the day the sun stops rising, and so they will come up with excuses, or justification or even denial. I know what Ace was. I know what he did.